There is a moment in every war when the map changes forever, when borders dissolve, capitals fall, and the world holds its breath waiting to see what comes next. In the summer of 1940, that moment arrived, and it arrived with a ferocity that no one in living memory had ever witnessed. France was gone, the Low Countries were gone, Denmark, Norway, Poland, gone. In the space of roughly 10 months, the armies of the Third Reich had swept across a continent that had taken the last Great War 4 years to contest. The speed of it was almost incomprehensible. Generals who had studied the grinding stalemate of 1914 to 1918 found themselves watching armored columns advance, not in yards, but in miles, not in weeks, but in days. And then they reached the coast. They stood at the edge of Europe, these soldiers of the Wehrmacht, and they looked out across a stretch of grey water that was, in places, no wider than 32 kilometers. On a clear day, and there are clear days on the French coast, even in wartime, you could stand on the cliffs above Calais and see the white chalk faces of Dover staring back at you. England, Britain, the last major power in Western Europe, still standing, still fighting, still refusing to accept what the rest of the continent had already conceded. And one man, standing at the very apex of German military power, looked at that strip of water and asked his generals a question that would shape the next 5 years of human history. Can we cross it? What followed was one of the most ambitious, most dangerous, and ultimately most catastrophic failures of strategic planning in the entire Second World War. A plan so vast it required the coordination of 3 separate armed services that despised each other. So logistically complex, it taxed the imagination of some of the finest military minds in Europe, and so fundamentally flawed at its core that the men tasked with executing it knew, privately, quietly, in the rooms where rank did not require optimism, that it probably could not succeed. This is the story of Operation Sea Lion, not the version cleaned up by post-war mythology, not the version in which Germany came agonizingly close to landing its troops on English beaches and changing everything, and not the version either in which the whole enterprise was always obviously doomed, a madman's fantasy that was never really taken seriously. The truth, as it almost always is, sits somewhere in the difficult middle, and that middle is far more interesting than either myth. Because there were real invasion barges. They gathered in real ports, Boulogne, Cherbourg, Calais, Antwerp, filled with real soldiers who were told at various points in that long, anxious summer that they might soon be wading ashore in Kent or Sussex. There were real staff officers drawing real maps of southern England, marking out landing zones and inland objectives, debating the relative merits of a broad front versus a narrow corridor, arguing over tide tables and moon phases and the seasonal window for a channel crossing. And on the other side of that same narrow water, there were real people who knew it too. Families in coastal towns who looked out at the sea and wondered whether German soldiers would be marching through their streets before Christmas. Old men who had survived 1 world war volunteering for the Home Guard, drilling in village squares with whatever weapons they could find, preparing to fight in the streets and hedgerows if it came to that. A prime minister who stood before a microphone and chose, very deliberately, not to lie to his people, but to tell them the truth, wrapped in language so defiant and so precise that it became its own kind of armor. This is also their story. But here is what makes Operation Sea Lion so remarkable to examine. All these decades later, it is not a story of what happened, it is a story of what did not. And those stories are, in their own way, the hardest to tell, because the absence of an event is not dramatic in the way that the event itself would have been. There are no beaches stormed, no defensive lines broken, no moments of singular crisis that resolve cleanly into victory or defeat. There is instead a slow, grinding, multi-front failure that nobody announced, nobody declared, and nobody quite acknowledged at the time. The invasion was postponed, then postponed again, then quietly, almost embarrassedly, allowed to fade from the official schedule. The barges sat in harbour through autumn and into winter, picked off intermittently by British bombers, rusting at their moorings, serving no purpose to anyone. The soldiers who had been briefed on their landing zones were quietly reassigned. The maps of southern England were folded away, and in Berlin, Hitler's gaze turned east. What we are going to walk through together over the next several hours is the full anatomy of that failure. We are going to look at the logistical nightmare that German planners faced when they actually sat down and calculated what crossing the Channel would require. And we are going to see how quickly those calculations revealed an operation that was not so much bold as it was borderline impossible. We are going to look at the air war that was supposed to clear the way for Sea Lion and understand precisely why the Royal Air Force did not break when every German prediction said it should have. We are going to look at the inter-service politics of the Wehrmacht, the army wanting one thing, the navy wanting another, Goering promising a third, and see how that institutional rivalry fatally undermined any coherent plan before a single soldier ever set foot on a barge. We are going to look at the technology that Britain had and Germany did not, the radar stations dotting the English coast that gave fighter command a quality of advance warning that changed the mathematics of the air war entirely. We are going to look at the pilots on both sides, their courage, their exhaustion, the brutal and very different arithmetic of fighting over enemy territory versus fighting over home soil. We are going to look at what Britain was actually doing during this period, how seriously the threat was taken, what preparations were made, and what would realistically have happened if the barges had crossed. And we are going to sit with the historians and strategists who have spent their careers asking the hardest question of all. Could it have worked, under any circumstances, with different choices, different timing, different luck? The answer will probably surprise you. If you are settling in for the night, if you have found this video at that hour, when the day is finally quiet, and the world has stopped demanding things from you, good. This is exactly the kind of story that rewards patience. It does not resolve in the first 20 minutes. It builds, the way real history builds, through accumulating detail and shifting context, until you arrive at the end understanding not just what happened, but why it could not have happened any other way, and why that matters. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, this would be a good moment. We make these documentaries for the long-form audience, for the people who want the full story, not just the highlights. Every week there is something new, and Operation Sea Lion is only the beginning of what we have planned. So settle in, get comfortable. Across the channel, the barges are gathering, and one of the most consequential non-events in modern military history is about to not happen. In the summer of 1940, Europe held its breath. Country after country had folded before the German advance. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and now France. The speed of it was staggering, almost obscene. What military planners across the world had assumed would be a grinding, years-long war of attrition had instead resolved itself in weeks. The Wehrmacht had cut through the Ardennes like a blade through cloth, bypassed the Maginot Line, trapped the Allied armies against the sea at Dunkirk, and then wheeled south to finish the job. On the 22nd of June 1940, French officials signed an armistice in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had surrendered in 1918, a location chosen deliberately, with theatrical cruelty. For Adolf Hitler, it was the greatest moment of his life. He stood, in those weeks, at a height that no German leader had reached since the age of Napoleon. The map of Europe, spread across the tables of the Reich Chancellery, was now almost entirely shaded in German influence. From the Arctic coast of Norway to the Pyrenees Mountains on the Spanish border, from the Atlantic seaboard of France to the borders of the Soviet Union, German power either controlled outright or had cowed into submission nearly every significant state on the continent. It was an achievement that Imperial Germany had failed to reach even at its most expansive, an achievement that the generals of the First World War would have considered a fantasy, and yet here it was, not a fantasy, but a present and operational fact. For the Nazi leadership, gathered in their various headquarters and ministry buildings across Berlin, the mood in those summer weeks was something close to euphoria. Yet one problem remained. One island, visible on a clear day from the cliffs of occupied France, had not submitted. Britain, the nation that France had relied upon, that the Low Countries had appealed to, that Norway had hoped would save them, stood across 22 miles of cold grey water and refused to acknowledge that the war was, by any conventional military logic, already over. Its army had been chased off the continent at Dunkirk, abandoning the bulk of its heavy equipment on the beaches. Its French ally had collapsed. Its government could have negotiated. There were political figures within Britain who believed it should, and yet the new Prime Minister, installed in May of that same year, had chosen a different course entirely, and the nation had, against all rational calculation, chosen to follow him. This defiance puzzled Hitler in a way that straightforward military opposition did not. He had, in various speeches and writings, expressed a kind of guarded admiration for the British Empire, for its administrative efficiency, its global reach, its capacity to govern vast territories with relatively small numbers of men. In his view, Britain and Germany were natural partners rather than enemies. Britain would control the seas and its empire. Germany would control the European continent. It was, in his estimation, a logical division of the world between two powers of Germanic stock. He had expected, after the fall of France, that Britain would recognize reality and come to the table. That it did not confounded him, and confusion in Hitler had a way of curling, over time, into anger. The German military machine, meanwhile, began the process that all military machines must perform when a new problem presents itself. It began to plan. The question of what to do about Britain was raised almost immediately after the armistice with France. Staff officers in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Armed Forces High Command, began preliminary discussions almost before the ink on the French surrender document had dried. The concept they were working toward was straightforward in outline and nightmarish in detail. A seaborne invasion of the British Isles, crossing the English Channel with sufficient force to establish a beachhead, then expanding that beachhead into a full military occupation. The operation was given a name: Operation Sea Lion. The name itself carried a certain confidence, even bravado. Lions, after all, do not typically swim. There was something almost defiant about the choice, as if the act of naming the thing were itself a declaration of intent strong enough to override the physical difficulties involved. And those difficulties were, even at the earliest stages of planning, formidable. The Channel is not merely water. It is one of the busiest, most strategically complex stretches of sea in the world, subject to fierce tidal currents, unpredictable weather, and fog that rolls in without warning. It had resisted invaders for nearly 900 years, since William of Normandy crossed it in the opposite direction in 1066. No German military commander had ever successfully made the crossing in force. Neither had Napoleon, who had once massed an invasion flotilla at Boulogne, and then, after years of preparation, turned it around and marched east instead. Hitler was aware of this history. He was a man who read voraciously, and who retained what he read with uncomfortable precision, deploying historical references in conversation to unsettle and impress those around him. He knew that the Channel had a reputation, but he also believed, and this belief was central to his entire strategic worldview, that will and momentum, properly applied, could overcome obstacles that more cautious men would declare insurmountable. He had proven it, or seemed to have proven it, over and over again. The Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France. Each time, the world had said it was impossible, or reckless, or certain to trigger catastrophe. And each time Hitler had pushed forward and the obstacle had dissolved. Why should Britain be any different? The German military leadership was less certain, though in the summer of 1940, relatively few of them said so loudly. The culture of the Wehrmacht's senior officer corps was one of professional competence filtered through political caution. Men who understood strategy and logistics with considerable sophistication, but who had learned, sometimes painfully, that contradicting the Führer's strategic intuitions carried personal consequences. So the planning continued, and the doubts were expressed in the language of technical requirement rather than fundamental objection. What would be needed, the staff officers asked, to make this work? The answers they arrived at were not encouraging. Thousands of vessels of varying type and capacity, air superiority over the Channel and southern England, a naval force capable of protecting the invasion corridor from the Royal Navy, sufficient troops, supplies, vehicles and artillery to fight a sustained campaign on British soil against a defending force that, despite its losses at Dunkirk, was being rapidly re-equipped and reinforced. The formal directive for Sea Lion was issued on the 16th of July 1940. The language of the document was, as such documents tend to be, precise and operational, laying out objectives, timelines, and command responsibilities with the appearance of organizational clarity. But beneath the bureaucratic surface of the directive lay a problem that no amount of planning language could paper over. Germany was, at its core, a continental land power. Its army was the finest in the world at that moment, mobile, experienced, tactically innovative, and led by men who had refined the art of combined arms warfare to a degree that no other nation had yet matched. But armies do not cross 22 miles of open water simply because their tactical doctrine is excellent. Crossing water requires ships, and Germany's relationship with ships was, to put it gently, complicated. The British, by contrast, were a maritime nation in the deepest possible sense. Their empire had been built on sea power. Their navy was not simply a branch of their military, it was, in many ways, the foundation of their national identity. The Royal Navy had fought and defeated the Spanish Armada, the Dutch fleet, Napoleon's maritime ambitions, and the Imperial German Navy in the waters off Jutland in 1916. It was numerically vast, operationally experienced, and entirely willing to contest any German attempt to cross the Channel with whatever force was necessary. Every German planner who looked honestly at the naval balance sheet in the summer of 1940 arrived at the same conclusion. Crossing the Channel under fire from the Royal Navy, without German naval supremacy to provide protection, was not a military operation. It was a mass drowning. And so the debate began. not over whether to invade, because politically that question had already been answered by the directive, but over how to create the conditions that might make invasion survivable. The German Navy, led by Admiral Erich Raeder, was blunt. Without control of the air above the channel, the surface fleet could not protect the invasion corridor, and without protection of the corridor, the invasion force would be destroyed en route. Control of the air, therefore, was not merely desirable, it was the absolute precondition upon which everything else depended. This logic transferred the burden of making Sea Lion possible from the Navy to the Luftwaffe. It transferred it, specifically, to a man who was never shy about accepting burdens, provided they came with sufficient publicity and personal glory. Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich, and the commander of the most powerful air force in Europe. The summer of 1940, then, became a summer of calculation and escalating pressure. The invasion barges were being requisitioned from the rivers and canals of occupied Europe. The troops designated for the first assault wave were training on the coasts of France and the Low Countries, practicing embarkation drills. The maps of southern England were being studied, landing beaches assessed, defensive positions evaluated, and high above the Channel, in a contest that would determine whether any of this preparation would ever amount to anything, the battle for the air was about to begin. What happened in that sky would decide whether Operation Sea Lion remained a plan on paper or became the most audacious military crossing since the Normans. The stakes, as understood by every serious military mind on both sides, could not have been plainer. The Channel waited, cold and indifferent, between two nations, one of which had decided to invade, and one of which had decided it would rather cease to exist than permit that to happen. The summer of 1940 carried with it a kind of terrible clarity. France had fallen in 6 weeks, an empire of soldiers, fortifications, and imperial pride reduced to rubble and armistice in less time than many had thought the opening skirmishes would last. The Wehrmacht stood at the Atlantic coast and stared westward across a strip of grey water that was, in places, barely 30 kilometres wide. From the cliff tops of the Pas de Calais, on a clear day, a man could see the chalk headlands of southern England. They looked close enough to touch, but the distance between seeing a thing and reaching it, between wanting a conquest and achieving one, is where history so often makes its harshest judgments. And the water between those two coastlines held a secret that would quietly, methodically, undo every German ambition pointed toward the British Isles. That secret was not encoded in any signal or buried in any intelligence file. It floated openly on the surface of the sea, visible to anyone with a naval chart and the courage to read what it truly said. The Royal Navy was waiting. To understand the scale of the problem facing Germany in the summer of 1940, you must first understand what the Kriegsmarine, Germany's naval arm, actually was, stripped of propaganda and prestige. It was a fleet designed not for open ocean supremacy, not for the kind of blue water dominance that an invasion of Britain would demand, but for a war of harassment. German naval doctrine had always leaned toward the submarine, toward the raider, toward the single powerful surface ship that could disrupt enemy commerce lanes and vanish before a response arrived. This was not cowardice in the design, it was realism. Germany had emerged from the First World War with its high seas fleet scuttled at Scapa Flow, its naval ambitions humiliated, its shipbuilding industry strangled by the terms of the peace. The years between the wars had not rebuilt what was lost. They had produced something impressive in isolation, something that made for arresting photographs and rousing newsreel footage, but something that would fold the moment it was measured against the full weight of British sea power. The Royal Navy, by contrast, was the inheritance of centuries. Britain had built its empire on water. Every trade route, every colonial possession, every strategic calculation the island nation had ever made was underwritten by the assumption of naval dominance. The fleet was not merely a military instrument. It was the expression of a national identity, a civilizational bet placed over generations that the sea belonged to Britain first and to everyone else second. In 1940, that fleet was damaged by the evacuation at Dunkirk, strained by obligations stretching from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean to the Far East, and yet it remained overwhelming. The number of destroyers alone that the Royal Navy could bring to bear in the English Channel dwarfed anything the Kriegsmarine could oppose. Cruisers, battleships, torpedo boats, the inventory read like a catalogue of German nightmares, each entry representing a hull that could intercept, engage, and sink an invasion convoy before the soldiers aboard ever saw the beach. German naval planners knew this. They were not fools, and they did not shy from the arithmetic. When staff officers at the Kriegsmarine began working through what a channel crossing would require, the numbers that came back were not the numbers of a manageable risk. They were the numbers of a catastrophe waiting for a date. An invasion fleet of the size the German army was requesting would need to cross roughly 100 kilometers of open water at its widest points, in vessels that were never designed for the open sea, during a window of weather that the English Channel, one of the most treacherous stretches of water in the world, offered with no guarantees and no patience for delays. And crossing that water, in those vessels, against an enemy that could position warships at multiple interception points along the southern coast of England, would mean absorbing losses that no army could absorb and still arrive capable of fighting. The Kriegsmarine's own internal assessments used language rarely found in the confident communiques of that summer. The word that appeared, again and again, was not optimism, it was risk, and not the manageable kind. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander of the Kriegsmarine, brought these concerns forward with a directness that was unusual for a military culture that had learned to tell Hitler what Hitler wished to hear. Raeder's position was not one of timidity, it was one of professional honesty. He understood that the Channel crossing, as proposed by the army, would require Germany to maintain a corridor of safe water stretching from the French coast to the English shoreline for days, potentially weeks, while troops, supplies, artillery, fuel, and ammunition were ferried across in a continuous stream. Maintaining that corridor meant neutralizing the Royal Navy, and neutralizing the Royal Navy meant having a fleet capable of defeating it in open engagement. Germany did not have that fleet. What Germany had was a collection of surface warships that had already suffered significant losses during the Norwegian campaign earlier that year, a campaign that had been strategically successful but had cost the Kriegsmarine a price it could not easily repay. Ships take years to build, crews take longer to train. The losses from Norway had not been replaced by the summer of 1940, and they would not be replaced in time for any invasion window. The barge problem compounded everything. When planners turned to the practical question of what vessels would actually carry German troops across the Channel, the answer they arrived at was deeply uncomfortable. Germany had no dedicated landing craft, no purpose-built assault vessels of the kind that a genuine amphibious operation demanded. What it had was river barges, hundreds of them, requisitioned from the inland waterways of Germany and occupied Europe, pulled away from their peacetime work of carrying coal and grain along the Rhine and the Elbe and the Danube. These barges were flat-bottomed, slow-moving, difficult to steer in open water, and had no military protection whatsoever. They sat low in the water, could not manage anything more than moderate sea conditions without risk of swamping, and would need to be towed by tugs for much of the crossing, because many of them had no engines capable of making headway against a channel swell. The German Navy calculated crossing times that stretched to 10 hours and beyond for certain vessel types. 10 hours in which British destroyers, moving at speeds the barges could not hope to match, could work through an invasion convoy from one end to the other. The Army, receiving these assessments, responded with the confidence of a service that had just conquered a continent in 6 weeks and believed the momentum of that victory was transferable to any domain. Army commanders drew up invasion plans that called for a broad front stretching across nearly 300 kilometers of English coastline, from Ramsgate in the east to Lyme Bay in the west. They wanted divisions landing simultaneously at multiple points, creating a web of bridgeheads that would overwhelm British defences before a coherent response could be organised. It was a reasonable plan if you assumed the sea passage was a formality, a brief inconvenience to be crossed and forgotten before the real fighting began. The Navy looked at the same plan and concluded that protecting a dispersed invasion fleet across that width of coastline was operationally impossible with the forces available. The Navy told the Army, with some bluntness, that what the Army was proposing was not an amphibious operation. It was a mass sacrifice of German soldiers to the Royal Navy, delivered by river barge. This fundamental disagreement between the German services would never be resolved, because it could not be resolved. The Army's demands reflected sound military thinking about how an invasion of Britain would need to be structured to have any hope of success on land. The Navy's objections reflected an equally sound understanding of what crossing the Channel against British sea power actually meant. Both were right within their own domains. The collision between those two correct assessments produced a planning paralysis that no amount of inter-service meeting could overcome. Hitler listened to both sides. He had not, before this moment, been seriously required to reckon with the limits of German power. Every campaign until now had succeeded. Every obstacle had dissolved before the Wehrmacht's momentum. The Channel was the first obstacle that did not dissolve, that could not be bypassed or outflanked, or simply overwhelmed by will and firepower. It simply sat there, grey and cold and indifferent, and the British ships moved within it, like the navy of a nation that had been defending that water for a very long time. The psychological weight of naval inferiority is difficult to overstate for a leadership group accustomed to overwhelming its enemies. Hitler's strategic instincts were fundamentally continental. He thought in terms of armies, of terrain, of the kind of mass force that had worked across Poland and France. The sea was an abstraction to him in a way that Russia was not, and his discomfort with naval matters showed in the way he engaged with them, impatiently, looking for shortcuts, looking for someone to tell him that the problem was smaller than the admirals suggested. Goering, characteristically, offered exactly that reassurance. The Luftwaffe, Goering insisted, could replace sea power with air power. If German aircraft controlled the skies above the Channel, British warships would not dare enter the invasion corridor. Surface vessels, Goering argued, were simply targets when they had no air cover. He was not entirely wrong about that last point. He was catastrophically wrong about what his air force could actually deliver, and at what cost, and over what time frame. But in the summer of 1940, his confidence filled a void that no one else in the German command was prepared to fill honestly. What Germany needed and could not manufacture in any realistic time frame was either naval parity with Britain or a reliable substitute for it. Neither existed. The submarine force, the great strength of the Kriegsmarine, was almost entirely useless for an invasion scenario. Submarines attack submerged, alone, against isolated targets, and an invasion corridor requires surface presence, coordination, and the ability to engage an enemy surface fleet in open battle. The heavy surface ships, the capital vessels that carried the most firepower, were too few, too damaged from previous operations, and too vulnerable to the mass destroyer attacks the Royal Navy could coordinate. Germany had power in many forms in the summer of 1940. It did not have the specific form of power that the English Channel demanded, and the Channel, unlike a French army or a Belgian fortification line, could not be outthought or outmaneuvered or bypassed by a different route. It was simply there, between the ambition and the target, and it was Britain's. And so the conversation that would shape the next phase of the war began not with a decision, but with a substitution. If the Navy could not guarantee safe passage, then the Luftwaffe would be asked to create the conditions under which safe passage might be possible. If the sea could not be controlled by ships, perhaps it could be controlled by aircraft. It was a theory built more from necessity than from evidence, proposed by a man whose faith in his own service was as vast and as ultimately hollow as the Channel itself was wide. The battle that followed from that substitution, fought not on water but in the air above southern England, would become one of the defining contests of the entire war. But the contest began here, in the margins of naval charts and the footnotes of staff assessments, where the German military looked at the numbers and discovered, for the first time, that the numbers did not bend in their favour. When the fall of France shocked the world into silence, one man in Berlin heard something different in that silence. Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, heard opportunity. He had spent years building the German Air Force from nothing, from the clandestine training programs of the 1920s, from the illegal rearmament that Versailles had forbidden, from the Spanish proving grounds of the late 1930s, where his pilots had practiced the art of killing at scale. By the summer of 1940, Göring commanded the most battle-hardened air force on earth, and he knew it. What he did not know, what his confidence would not permit him to seriously consider, was that hardening alone does not guarantee victory. He went to Hitler with a promise: "Give me the sky over England, and I will deliver you England itself." The promise arrived at precisely the right moment. Hitler's military planners had already briefed him on the Royal Navy problem in terms that admitted no comfortable solution. To put German soldiers on English beaches, Germany would need to cross roughly 35 kilometers of water, while British destroyers and cruisers carved through invasion barges with impunity. The Kriegsmarine could not stop them. The German surface fleet, still recovering from the savage losses of the Norway campaign earlier that year, was in no condition to fight the most powerful naval force in the world in its own coastal waters. But Göring offered a way around the problem rather than through it. If the Luftwaffe could first destroy the Royal Air Force, then establish sustained air superiority over the Channel and the southern English coast, German bombers could hold the Royal Navy back long enough for troops to land. It was a solution built on assumptions, and assumptions built on pride. Göring's confidence was not baseless. In the spring of 1940, the Luftwaffe had performed feats that seemed to rewrite the rules of modern warfare. The blitzkrieg that had torn through the Low Countries and France was not purely a ground campaign. It was an air campaign feeding a ground campaign, with Junkers dive bombers clearing the path ahead of panzer columns with devastating precision. Rotterdam had been reduced to rubble in a single afternoon. The airfields of France and Belgium had been captured or neutralized with speed that left Allied planners struggling to respond. The pilots were confident, the ground crews were experienced, and the supply chains were functioning. On paper, the Luftwaffe was a machine at the peak of its power. What the paper could not easily measure was distance. The fundamental geographical reality of the Battle of Britain was one that would haunt every German formation that crossed the coastline heading northwest. The primary German single-engine fighter, the Messerschmitt 109, was among the finest aircraft of its era, fast, agile, deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot. But it had been designed for a European land war, not for extended overwater operations against an island nation. Carrying enough fuel to reach London from bases in northern France or the Low Countries, a Messerschmitt 109 pilot had, at best, perhaps 20 minutes of combat time over the target before the fuel mathematics turned brutal. The further north the raid, the thinner that margin became. German bomber crews quickly understood that their escorts could only protect them for part of the journey. Over England, they would sometimes be alone. The campaign that became known as the Battle of Britain began in earnest in the summer of 1940, though its early phases were neither dramatic nor decisive. German formations probed British coastal radar stations and shipping lanes in the Channel, testing responses, measuring reaction times, watching where the British fighters appeared from and how quickly. These initial raids were carefully studied on both sides. For the Luftwaffe, they were intelligence gathering dressed as operations. For Fighter Command and its commander, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, they were a lesson in what was coming. Dowding was not a man given to theatrical gestures or inspiring speeches. He was methodical, analytical, and deeply protective of his aircraft and pilots in a way that sometimes irritated colleagues who mistook caution for timidity. He understood that his task was not to win every engagement, it was to avoid losing the war before Germany ran out of the will to fight it. Then came August. Goering issued orders for a concentrated campaign against Royal Air Force airfields, radar stations, and sector control facilities in southeastern England. The Luftwaffe called this phase the Eagle Attack, and the intent was specific. Within days, perhaps a week, Fighter Command would be torn from the sky. Without fighters, British bombers would be helpless. Without both, the island would be a target rather than a fortress. Hundreds of aircraft crossed the English coast in formations that eyewitnesses on the ground described as filling the sky from one horizon edge to the other. The sound alone, the deep, unsynchronized throb of German bomber engines, distinct from the sharper pitch of British fighters, became the signature noise of that particular summer, a sound a generation of English civilians would never forget. The fighting was relentless, day after day, in weather that was, by the bitter irony of war, among the most beautiful that season had produced in years. Contrails traced across blue skies above the orchards and fields of Kent and Sussex, white spirals that marked where aircraft had turned hard or dived or broken apart. On the ground, farmers and children watched the battles above them with a mixture of fascination and terror that no distance could entirely cushion. Up there, within those distant white threads, men were dying in seconds. A pilot who took a cannon round through his engine at high altitude had perhaps moments to decide whether his aircraft could be saved or whether the parachute was his only remaining option. Many did not have time to decide at all. The pilots on both sides were extraordinary in the most literal sense, meaning they existed outside the ordinary experience of what young men were supposed to endure. German fighter pilots, flying multiple missions in a single day, carried a fatigue that accumulated faster than sleep could repair it. Their British counterparts were scrambled at all hours, sometimes climbing to altitude 3 or 4 times between dawn and dusk, landing to refuel while the engine still ticked with heat, then climbing again before the body had absorbed the terror of the previous sortie. Squadron commanders on the British side watched their most experienced pilots thin out with each passing week. New arrivals from the training pipeline sometimes lasted only days before their names were added to the lists that nobody wanted to compile. The arithmetic of attrition was merciless on both sides, but it pressed differently on each. For all its power, the Luftwaffe was fighting at the outer limit of what its structure could sustain. German aircraft losses over England could not easily be recovered in the short term. A fighter destroyed over Kent was gone, and its pilot, if he survived at all, would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner rather than returning to his unit the following morning. British pilots who bailed out over home soil did exactly that. They returned. Ground crews worked through nights lit only by shielded torches, patching aircraft, replacing engines, rebuilding what the previous day had damaged. The British production system, energized by the Ministry of Aircraft Production and pushed to extraordinary output under political pressure, was turning out replacement fighters at a rate that surprised even optimistic British planners. The gap between what Germany expected to find and what it actually encountered in the air above southern England grew wider with each passing week of the campaign. Goering grew frustrated in the particular way that powerful men grow frustrated when reality declines their instructions. He demanded more aggression from his pilots, attributed ongoing losses to lack of fighting spirit, rather than to the structural disadvantages his force was operating under. He called his senior fighter commanders to meetings that produced criticism rather than solutions. One such commander, a young and already famous German ace, reportedly told Goering, with uncomfortable bluntness during one of these encounters, that what he needed most was more range on his fighters, a request that amounted to an admission that the campaign's geography was defeating them. Goering dismissed the suggestion. The answer, in his view, was always more pressure, more raids, more formations over England. What he did not understand, or refused to understand, was that pressure applied without strategic precision is simply cost without return. By late August and into September of 1940, fighter command was hurting. The targeting of airfields and sector stations was beginning to bite in ways that raw aircraft numbers alone did not fully capture. Ground facilities were damaged, communication lines were cut and repaired, and cut again, and exhaustion in the system was deepening from pilot level to controller level to the support personnel who kept the entire operation functioning. Some historians who have studied that particular period argue that another week or two of the same focused campaign against RAF infrastructure might have forced Fighter Command into a retreat from its forward bases in the southeast, yielding the airspace Germany needed. Whether or not that assessment is correct, it describes the margin, not miles, not months, but something measured in days of sustained, disciplined pressure, and that pressure was about to be redirected. Not because the Luftwaffe had won, but because something happened over London that changed the entire course of the campaign, and not in Germany's favour. What the summer of 1940 ultimately revealed was the distance between a promise and its conditions. Goering had offered Hitler the sky. What he delivered instead was a campaign of mounting cost, grinding attrition, and strategic miscalculation against an enemy that turned out to be harder, better prepared, and more resilient than confidence had allowed him to calculate. The Battle of Britain was not yet over in September of 1940, but its shape had already declared something important. The assumption that air power alone could break a determined nation defending its own ground was not, in fact, a strategy. It was a gamble. And the first returns from that gamble were not what anyone in Berlin had promised they would be. Along the southeastern coast of England, in the summer of 1940, a row of tall, skeletal towers stood against the grey coastal sky. They looked, to the untrained eye, like the kind of industrial scaffolding one might find at a construction site. Angular, utilitarian, unremarkable. German reconnaissance pilots photographed them. German intelligence analysts studied the photographs. And then, almost unbelievably, Germany's military leadership largely dismissed them. That dismissal would cost the Luftwaffe the Battle of Britain before the battle had truly begun. The towers were the chain-home radar stations, and they were, at that precise moment in history, among the most consequential pieces of military infrastructure on the planet. Their secret was not that they were invisible. Their secret was that no one on the German side understood, quickly enough, what they were actually capable of doing. The science behind radar was not exclusively British. German engineers had developed their own radar systems, and German naval commanders used them with considerable effectiveness at sea. But what Britain had built along its southern and eastern coastline was something fundamentally different. Not a single technology, but an integrated system, a network. Dozens of stations stretched from the northern tip of Scotland down to the southwestern headlands, each one feeding information into a coordinated web of reporting, analysis, and command. No other nation in 1940 had assembled anything like it at this scale. The British called it the Dowding System, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the quiet, methodical commander who had championed its development for years, while colleagues questioned both the cost and the concept. Dowding had insisted, with the kind of stubborn patience history tends to reward, that technology properly organized could compensate for numerical disadvantage. He was right. Here is how the system actually worked, because the engineering details matter as much as the drama. The chain-home stations broadcast powerful radio pulses outward across the Channel and the North Sea. When those pulses struck an incoming aircraft, or a formation of aircraft, they bounced back to the receiving towers. Operators, many of them young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, sat at cathode ray tube screens and watched for the telltale returns. They could estimate range, bearing, and, with training, the approximate size of an incoming raid. This information was then relayed immediately, not after a delay, not after a committee meeting, but within minutes, to the filter room at Headquarters Fighter Command, located at Bentley Priory in Middlesex. There, intelligence officers cross-referenced multiple station reports, filtered out duplicate or false readings, and constructed a composite picture of the incoming threat. The resulting data went to the operations room, where it was plotted on a large horizontal map table by more operators using colored counters and long-handled rakes, like something from a casino floor reimagined for war. Senior controllers, watching from a raised gallery above, looked down at a living, moving portrait of the air battle as it was happening. That word, happening, deserves emphasis. Not as it had happened 10 minutes ago, not as intelligence analysts predicted it might happen, as it was happening in near real time. Before radar, Fighter Command's only early warning came from the Observer Corps, networks of civilian volunteers with binoculars and telephones positioned along the coast, doing their best to count aircraft and estimate headings by eye and ear. The Observer Corps was courageous and genuinely useful, and would remain a vital part of the system throughout the battle. But human observers, however dedicated, could not see through cloud, could not reliably count fast-moving formations at high altitude, and could not give commanders the lead time needed to scramble fighters and get them to altitude before German bombers arrived over their targets. Chain home changed the equation entirely. It gave Fighter Command, on a good day, 20 to 30 minutes of warning before a raid reached the English coast. 20 to 30 minutes was enough time to scramble squadrons, climb to altitude, position fighters with the height advantage, and choose the angle of interception. It transformed the defensive battle from a desperate reaction into something approaching a managed response. The sector stations formed the next layer of the system. Once a raid was identified and its probable target assessed, the relevant sector controller received the plotting data and was authorized to scramble specific squadrons from specific airfields. The controller would then communicate directly with the airborne pilots by radio, giving them vectors, headings and altitudes, updated in real time as both the German formation and the British fighters moved. Pilots did not need to search the sky blindly, burning fuel and wasting the precious altitude they had spent minutes climbing to reach. They were guided, course correction by course correction, toward an interception that the Germans could not know was coming with such precision. For a German bomber crew crossing the channel in tight formation, expecting to find a defending force that was scrambling in confusion and arriving too late or too low, the sudden appearance of Spitfires and Hurricanes at exactly the right altitude and bearing must have been deeply unsettling. It happened again and again and again. The young women who operated the radar screens and the plotting tables have, for too long, occupied a smaller place in the popular story of the Battle of Britain than the fighter pilots themselves. Their role was not peripheral, it was structural. A radar return is not a clear picture. It is a smear of light on a glass tube, shaped by atmospheric conditions, equipment variations, and the geometry of the aircraft's approach angle. Reading it accurately, under pressure, with raids incoming simultaneously from multiple directions, required genuine skill, developed through weeks of training and sharpened through experience. A misread return could send fighters to the wrong location, leaving bombers free to reach their target. An accurate reading, communicated rapidly and clearly, could put a squadron in exactly the right position. The operators understood this. They sat at their screens during raids, in stations that had been identified, even if not fully understood, by German reconnaissance, knowing that they themselves were potential targets. Several radar stations were attacked during the battle. The operators did not leave their equipment. Germany's failure to press its attacks on the radar stations was one of the defining strategic errors of the entire campaign. Early raids did strike several chain-home facilities, and the results were significant. Temporary disruptions to coverage, gaps in the tracking picture, moments when fighter command was genuinely flying partially blind. Had those attacks been sustained, coordinated, and prioritized above all other targets, the system might have been degraded to the point where it ceased to function as an integrated network. The evidence suggests that German planners never developed a clear enough understanding of how the system worked to appreciate what they would gain by destroying it thoroughly. They saw towers. They did not see the underground cables, the filter rooms, the sector controllers, the plotting tables, and the web of telephone lines connecting every component into a single functioning organism. Attacking the towers alone was like cutting one branch of a tree and expecting the tree to fall. There was also a cultural dimension to the German misreading. The Luftwaffe's leadership, including Goering himself, had invested enormous confidence in their pilots' aggressive capability and in the idea that German airmen were individually superior to their British counterparts. In that worldview, victory came from combat skill and fighting spirit, not from ground-based technology managed by operators in bunkers. The British system did not fit the narrative of air war as the Germans understood it, which made it harder for them to take it seriously even when evidence of its effectiveness mounted with each failed raid. German fighter pilots began to notice that British defenders appeared with uncanny consistency, not randomly scattered across the sky, but positioned, purposeful, waiting. Some pilots understood, dimly, that something systematic was guiding the opposition, but the operational changes needed to neutralize that system never came in time. The radar advantage was not absolute, and honesty about its limitations matters. Chain-home was technically crude by the standards that would emerge later in the war. Its coverage was better at medium and high altitude than at low level, which German planners eventually exploited through low-altitude approach profiles that partially defeated the station's geometry. The system sometimes produced ambiguous or contradictory information, requiring skilled human judgment to resolve under time pressure. On busy days, when multiple large raids crossed the coast simultaneously, the filter and operations rooms faced genuine data overload, and controllers made decisions with incomplete information. The battle was never reduced to a clean technological equation where British scientists simply pressed a button and German aircraft fell from the sky. It remained, throughout, desperately close, a matter of exhausted pilots, burning aircraft, damaged airfields, and decisions made in seconds. But the radar network meant that fighter command's exhausted pilots were exhausted in the most efficient possible way, directed rather than wandering, fighting battles they had at least a chance to win on something approaching favorable terms. By midsummer of 1940, the pattern was visible to anyone willing to read the attrition honestly. German raids were suffering losses that Luftwaffe planners had not projected. Interception rates were higher than they should have been against a defending force that was, on paper, numerically inferior. Experienced German aircrew, bomber crews who had flown over Poland and France, fighter pilots with multiple victories, were not returning from missions over England at a rate that could be sustained indefinitely. Some within the Luftwaffe's intelligence apparatus suspected that the British were somehow reading German radio communications, breaking codes, or receiving help from agents positioned across the channel. The truth, that a network of ground stations and a room full of young women with cathode ray tubes and plotting boards were coordinating the entire defense, was in some ways too prosaic to seem credible. But it was the truth. The chain-home system did not win the Battle of Britain alone. Nothing single-handedly wins or loses a battle of that scale and duration. The courage of the pilots, the resilience of the ground crews who repaired aircraft through the night, the production effort that replaced losses faster than German intelligence estimated, the decisions made by commanders on both sides, all of these shaped the outcome. But the radar network provided the framework within which everything else could function effectively. Without it, fighter command would have been reactive, scattered, and far more costly in losses relative to each German aircraft shot down. With it, Britain could defend its skies with a force smaller than the one attacking it, and still deny the Luftwaffe the clean victory it needed. That denial was not dramatic. It accumulated across weeks of interceptions, failed raids, and mounting German losses, until the arithmetic of the campaign began to tell a different story than the one Hermann Göring had promised Adolf Hitler. The towers along the coast had said nothing, broadcast no propaganda, made no speeches. They had simply watched the sky and told the truth of what they saw. Above the chalk cliffs and green fields of southern England, a quiet arithmetic was being written in smoke and metal. It was not the arithmetic of grand strategy or political will. It was simpler, colder, and far more decisive. Every morning, German fighter pilots climbed into their cockpits on French airfields and crossed a narrow strip of water that, in terms of fuel and time, might as well have been an ocean. Every evening, if they made it back, they landed exhausted, debriefed, and were told to do it again tomorrow. The numbers governing their survival were not abstract. They were measured in liters of fuel, in minutes of flight time, in the dwindling margin between engagement and the point of no return. The English Channel, barely 32 kilometers wide at its narrowest, imposed a brutal tax on every mission the Luftwaffe flew, and the Germans were paying that tax whether they understood it or not. The Messerschmitt 109 was, by almost any technical measure, one of the finest single-engine fighters in the world in the summer of 1940. Its pilots had proven themselves over Spain, Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Many had accumulated combat hours that their British counterparts simply could not match. Confidence ran through the Jagdgeschwader, the fighter wings, like a current, reinforced by the swift collapses of every previous enemy they had faced. But confidence is not fuel, and the 109, for all its speed and firepower, carried a range that had been designed for an entirely different kind of war. Over Britain, a German fighter pilot crossing the coast at full throttle had, in practical terms, somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes of combat flying time before he had to turn for home. That was not a rumor or an exaggeration. It was the arithmetic of his fuel gauge, and it dictated every decision he made over English soil. British pilots understood this, even if they could not always see it. The controllers on the ground, reading the plots from the radar chain and the observer corps, knew that the raids coming in from the French coast were flying against a clock. The longer they could keep German fighters engaged, the deeper those pilots flew into their reserve margins, the more desperate their return crossing became. This knowledge shaped how the Royal Air Force fought. When a squadron of Hurricanes was directed away from the escort fighters and toward the bomber formation, it was not recklessness, it was calculation. Let the Spitfires tie up the 109s at altitude. Let the Hurricanes tear into the Heinkels and Dorniers, and the German fighters watching their fuel gauges would eventually have to break off, regardless of what was happening below them. Geography was being weaponized, quietly and effectively, by men in filter rooms and operations centers who never fired a single round. The German pilots did not suffer in silence. Letters home, debriefs, and the private remarks of senior Jagdwaffe commanders all reflected the same mounting frustration. They were being asked to escort bombers deep into England, to loiter over targets while the bombers ran their attack sequences, and then somehow to fight their way back across the water on fumes. Requests to alter tactics, to allow fighter sweeps ahead of the bombers, to refuse close escort in favor of looser top cover, were largely dismissed by Goering, who blamed the fighter arm for what was in fact a structural impossibility. The fighters were not failing because they lacked skill or courage. They were failing because the mission as designed could not be accomplished within the physical limits of their aircraft. It was a problem that no amount of willpower or tactical brilliance could overcome, and the men flying those missions knew it with a clarity that their commanders in Paris and Berlin refused to share. On the British side, the arithmetic ran differently, but it was no less brutal in its early weeks. The Royal Air Force entered the battle short of experienced pilots, and the pace of combat in July and August of 1940 ground through trained men at a frightening rate. Squadrons that began the summer with full complements found themselves flying with 8 pilots, then 7, then fewer. The strain on the survivors was immense. Multiple sorties a day, brief returns to base for rearming and refueling, snatched meals eaten standing beside dispersal huts, and then climbing back into the sky to do it again. Sleep became a luxury. Reaction times dulled. Men who had been flying since before dawn found themselves airborne again at dusk, their bodies running on something beyond ordinary endurance. The margin between disciplined fighting and simple exhaustion grew dangerously thin. Yet the British pilot who was shot down over England faced a fundamentally different fate from his German counterpart. if a Royal Air Force pilot survived being hit, if he had the altitude to bail out and the luck to open his parachute in time, he came down on home soil. He might land in a farmer's field in Kent, be offered a cup of tea, and return to his squadron by nightfall. If he was wounded but alive, he was taken to a British hospital and in many cases returned to flying within days or weeks. His aircraft was lost, but he was not. The same emergency over the Channel or over France meant capture, death, or a desperate swim in cold water with no rescue in sight. The German pilot who bailed out over England became a prisoner of war. The gap between those two outcomes, repeated across hundreds of engagements over the summer, became one of the most consequential asymmetries of the entire air campaign. Replacement training tells another part of the story, and it is one that the Luftwaffe's command structure was dangerously slow to confront. The German system for producing combat-ready fighter pilots had been built for a different tempo of war, one of swift campaigns, rapid victories, and time to reconsolidate. The sustained, grinding attrition of the Battle of Britain was something else entirely. Replacement pilots arriving at German fighter units in August and September of 1940 were, in many cases, inadequately prepared for the environment they were entering. They had fewer flying hours than those they were replacing, less experience in the specific demands of high-altitude combat over water, and they were being thrown into one of the most technically demanding air battles in history. The veterans who might have mentored them were themselves exhausted or dead. The Royal Air Force faced its own replacement crisis, but it responded with a degree of institutional flexibility that the Luftwaffe could not match. Training pipelines were shortened. Overseas pilots from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Rhodesia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and several other nations were integrated into frontline squadrons in numbers that made a measurable difference. The Polish pilots in particular, men who had already lost their homeland and had a very personal account to settle with the German Air Force, flew with a ferocity that earned the respect and, at times, the bewilderment of their RAF colleagues. These men were not replacements in any diminished sense of the word. They were experienced combat aviators, burning with a motivation that needed no official encouragement. Their presence added both numbers and a particular intensity to the British effort at precisely the moment it was most needed. The numbers being compiled on both sides were tracking toward a crossover point, though it was not visible in any single day's ledger. German fighter losses, aircraft destroyed, pilots killed or captured, were accumulating at a rate the Luftwaffe's training system could not absorb. British losses were also severe, but the structural advantages of fighting at home were blunting the deficit in ways that pure aircraft counts did not fully capture. An aircraft lost on both sides was one aircraft, but a British pilot lost was, in many cases, still a British pilot, resting, recovering, returning. A German pilot lost over England was simply gone. This distinction, multiplied across weeks of combat, was quietly reshaping the balance of the air battle in ways that German intelligence was either failing to measure or choosing to report upward with dangerous optimism. Goering's response to the emerging reality was to shift blame and double down on pressure. When fighter pilots explained the fuel constraints, he accused them of cowardice. When experienced commanders requested tactical changes, they were dismissed or bypassed. One of the Luftwaffe's most capable fighter leaders of the period made the point explicitly in a confrontation with Goering that became something of a legend in aviation circles. When asked what he needed to win the battle, his reply was blunt to the point of insubordination. He asked for a squadron of Spitfires. The remark was born of frustration. not genuine admiration for the enemy's equipment. What he was really asking for was an aircraft that could do what the mission demanded, one that could stay over England long enough to actually protect the bombers it was supposed to escort. No such aircraft existed in the Luftwaffe's inventory in 1940, and no amount of command pressure was going to conjure one into being. By the late weeks of summer and the first weeks of autumn, the cumulative weight of the attrition was beginning to show in the quality of German operations over England. Raids that had once pressed deep into the British interior were pulling back toward the coast. Escort formations were tighter, more defensive, more concerned with survival than with aggressive cover. The experienced core of the Jagdwaffe, the men who had grown up in the cockpit, who had fought over 3 previous campaigns, was thinning. In their place flew younger pilots who knew less, saw less, and lasted a shorter time. The spiral was not yet irreversible, but the direction was clear to anyone reading the data without ideological interference. What the Battle of Britain demonstrated, in the end, was that a qualitative edge in aircraft and pilot skill could not substitute for a structural mismatch in the conditions under which those pilots were asked to fight. The Luftwaffe brought experience, technology, and genuine tactical ability to the contest. What it could not bring was time over the target, time to recover losses, time to train replacements to the standard the campaign demanded. The Royal Air Force, fighting from its own ground, absorbing losses but recovering pilots, drawing on the multinational community of men who had come to Britain to fight, was operating inside a logic that consistently favoured persistence over brilliance. The fighter-pilot equation was not solved in any single dramatic engagement. It resolved itself, slowly and mercilessly, through the unforgiving mathematics of endurance. By the late summer of 1940, the arithmetic of air war had turned against Germany in ways that could no longer be ignored. The Luftwaffe had entered the campaign with a simple and confident premise: overwhelm the Royal Air Force, clear the skies, and open the channel to invasion forces below. But weeks of grinding combat had produced something no German planner had fully accounted for. Fighter command had not collapsed. It had bent, strained, bled, and held. The replacement rates on the British side, while painful, were keeping pace with losses in ways the German side could not match across the water. Hermann Göring, a man not naturally inclined toward admitting failure, found himself confronting a battle that refused to resolve itself on his terms. Something had to change, and the change that came would shift the nature of the war entirely. The trigger, as history often records it, was almost accidental in character. German bombers, losing their way in the dark over England, dropped their loads on residential areas of London rather than their intended military targets. The British response was swift and deliberate. A retaliatory raid on Berlin, a city Hitler had personally promised his people would never be touched. The bombs fell, and the shock to German pride was immediate. Göring had made that promise. The Führer had amplified it. Now the promise lay in rubble, and the rage that followed it would reshape German strategy in ways that ultimately served Britain's survival more than Germany's ambition. Emotion, not calculation, began driving decisions at the highest level. Hitler's response came with the weight of wounded fury. He announced publicly, in terms stripped of any military nuance, that German bombers would now raze British cities to the ground. The crowd that heard him roared its approval, but inside the operational rooms of the Luftwaffe, more cautious minds understood something troubling in that applause. The shift from targeting Royal Air Force airfields and radar stations to targeting civilian populations meant the strategic goal had quietly changed. Germany was no longer trying to achieve air superiority as a precondition for invasion. It was now trying to break the will of an entire people, a far larger ambition, and one with no guaranteed military endpoint. The invasion clock, already under pressure, was being handed a new and uncertain task. The 7th of September 1940 is a date that lives in British collective memory with particular weight. That afternoon, as the autumn light began to thin over the Thames estuary, a formation of German aircraft of a size not yet seen over England crossed the coast and turned toward London. More than 300 bombers, escorted by fighters, moved in a stream that ground observers described as darkening the sky. The docks of the East End bore the first and heaviest blows. Warehouses holding timber, paint, sugar, and rum caught fire and burned with a ferocity that lit the Thames for miles in every direction. Emergency services that had never encountered anything on this scale scrambled into streets where fire raced faster than hoses could follow. By the time the first wave turned for home, a second was already crossing the coast. That night, the fires the afternoon raid had left burning served as a beacon. The German night bombers that followed needed no navigation equipment beyond the orange glow visible from the French coast. They came in waves through the darkness, and the bombs fell across East London, across Stepney and Whitechapel and Bermondsey, into communities already exhausted from the afternoon's violence. Hundreds died before dawn. Thousands more were made homeless. The shelters, the underground stations, the basement rooms, the brick-and-mortar Anderson shelters sunk into back gardens, filled with families clutching whatever they had managed to carry. The scale of what had arrived was something no civilian population in history had quite faced in this form, and the city held its breath for the morning. But the morning revealed something that troubled German planners more than they expected. London had not broken. The fires were real. The death toll was real. The suffering was entirely real, and yet the city had not descended into panic or social collapse. Civil defense workers returned to the rubble. Factories reopened. The underground ran where it could. The British government, watching carefully for signs of civilian revolt or mass psychological fracture, instead found a population that seemed to harden rather than dissolve under pressure. This was not stubbornness born of ignorance. These were people who understood exactly what was falling on them, who could count the bodies and still report for work the following morning. It confounded the logic that had underpinned the entire strategy. The Blitz, as the nightly raids came to be known, continued through the autumn and into winter, with a relentless rhythm that became a kind of grim routine. Sirens in the early evening, the groan of engines overhead, the crump and shudder of explosions moving through the streets in patterns that could not be predicted. London absorbed the heaviest burden, but it was not alone. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Plymouth, Southampton. The bombers ranged across the country, striking ports, industrial centres, railway junctions, and the neighbourhoods that surrounded them. Coventry suffered a raid of particular devastation in the autumn of 1940 that reduced much of its medieval city centre to open sky. Its cathedral left as a standing wound against the horizon. The intention had been to destroy its manufacturing capacity. The reality was that production resumed within days, relocated, dispersed, stubbornly rebuilt. What German strategists had misread was the relationship between physical destruction and industrial output. Bombing a factory was not the same as stopping it. British industry had begun dispersing production before the raids intensified, spreading components and sub-assemblies across multiple sites precisely to prevent any single strike from ending output entirely. Aircraft production, the metric that mattered most to both sides, actually increased through the Blitz months rather than declining. The shadow factories hidden in the Midlands and beyond were turning out Hurricanes and Spitfires at rates that the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign, for all its violence, could not suppress. The strategy of breaking Britain's capacity to fight from the air was failing at the exact moment it was being pursued with maximum effort. The human cost, however, was beyond calculation in purely strategic terms. By the time the intensity of the night campaign began to ease in the spring of 1941, tens of thousands of British civilians had been killed, with London alone bearing losses that staggered the imagination. The injured numbered far more. Hundreds of thousands had lost their homes, their streets, their neighborhoods, entire communities erased or fundamentally altered. This suffering was not abstract. It was granular and intimate, a family's possessions on the pavement, a child's school reduced to brickwork, a pub where men had drunk together for decades, suddenly a gap in a familiar skyline. And yet the cumulative weight of this destruction produced not capitulation but something closer to its opposite. Morale is a complex thing, resistant to simple measurement, and it would be dishonest to suggest that British civilians felt no fear, no despair, no moments of wanting it to simply stop. They felt all of those things, deeply and honestly. But fear and despair are not the same as surrender, and what the Luftwaffe's campaign produced was a distinction between private suffering and public resolve that German planners had not accounted for in their models. Churchill's broadcasts reached people in shelters and kitchens and workplaces, not as empty promises, but as a voice that acknowledged the darkness without pretending it was light. When he described the ordeal as something to be endured and ultimately overcome, people who had just survived a night of bombing chose, again and again, to believe him. Within the Luftwaffe itself, the toll of the campaign was equally severe in ways that would not become fully visible until later. Night bombing required different skills than daylight precision raids, and many crews were neither trained nor equipped for it with the sophistication the mission demanded. Navigation errors were frequent, bombs scattered, intended targets missed. The crews who flew these missions did so in darkness, over a blackened country, under fire from anti-aircraft guns whose accuracy improved with each passing week, knowing that the return journey offered its own dangers. The losses, while not always dramatic on any single night, accumulated steadily. Experienced crews, the men who had flown since the Spanish Civil War or the early campaigns in Poland and France, were being consumed in a campaign that was producing no decisive result. They were not being replaced at the same rate they were being lost, and that gap would widen through the winter. By the time spring of 1941 approached, and Hitler's gaze had already swung east toward the vast spaces of the Soviet Union, the Blitz had run its strategic course without delivering anything resembling the outcome it had promised. Britain had not broken. Its air force had not been destroyed. Its factories had not been silenced. Its population had endured something terrible and emerged, battered but functional, on the other side. The shift from precision targeting to mass terror bombing had been a moment of strategic bankruptcy dressed as aggression, a decision that revealed, more clearly than anything before it, that German planning had entered a phase driven by frustration rather than logic. Desperation had displaced calculation, and the channel remained exactly as wide as it had always been. In the spring of 1940, as German tanks rolled through France and the swastika flew over Paris, Hitler's military planners faced a problem that no amount of blitzkrieg could solve. Across the English Channel lay Britain, isolated, defiant, but protected by something far more formidable than any army. 30 kilometers of water and the Royal Navy. The question that haunted every German staff meeting was not whether invasion was theoretically possible, but how to actually move hundreds of thousands of men, horses, vehicles and supplies across that stretch of sea without the Royal Navy annihilating them mid-crossing. The Wehrmacht had conquered most of Europe with speed and coordinated movement, but those victories had come on land, where tanks could thunder forward and air support could rain down fire from above. The Channel presented a different problem entirely. It demanded something the German military had never seriously developed: a proper amphibious capability, including specialized landing craft, dedicated transport vessels, and naval protection sufficient to match the world's most powerful fleet. Germany possessed none of these things, and building them would require time that Hitler did not believe he had. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, began assessing what was actually available in German-controlled ports in the spring of 1940. What they found was sobering. Germany had no purpose-built landing craft. The world's first truly modern amphibious assault would not occur until years later, and Germany had not anticipated needing one. Instead, planners had to improvise using vessels that had been designed for entirely different purposes. River barges that normally carried coal and grain along the Rhine and other European waterways, converted fishing boats, tugboats, and hastily modified transport ships. These were not vessels capable of withstanding sustained naval gunfire or air attack. They were slow, ungainly, and vulnerable. A typical invasion barge, when fully loaded with men and equipment, moved at roughly 6 kilometers per hour, meaning a crossing of the Channel would require between 5 and 8 hours, depending on the crossing point and tidal conditions. 8 hours was an eternity in wartime. 8 hours meant exposure to British attack from beginning to end, with no means of accelerating the process, and no naval escort powerful enough to guarantee protection. The logistical mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. To move a single army corps across the Channel required between 200 and 300 transport vessels and barges. To move the forces that German planners considered necessary for a viable invasion, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 troops for the initial assault waves, with follow-on reinforcements, required commandeering nearly all available transport in German-controlled Europe. Barges had to be gathered from inland waterways across France, Germany, and the conquered Low Countries. Some were towed great distances to Channel assembly ports, a process that consumed weeks and left Germany's inland transport system crippled. Fishing boats and merchant vessels were seized from French and Norwegian ports, stripped of civilian crews, and hastily prepared for military service. The requisitions left civilians stranded and undermined the occupying authorities' claim to orderly administration. Every available truck, horse-drawn wagon, and crane in occupied France seemed to be moving toward the coast to support the invasion effort. The economic disruption was massive, and the window of opportunity was closing as summer 1940 moved toward autumn. The question of supply lines proved even more daunting than initial transport. It was one thing to get invasion troops across the Channel in a single desperate push. It was another thing entirely to keep them supplied once they had landed. Across the sea, the troops would need ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement equipment, and fuel. These supplies had to cross the same vulnerable 30 kilometers of water that the invasion forces themselves had to cross, and they had to do so repeatedly, day after day, under conditions of active combat. A soldier fighting in southern England needed roughly 1 kilogram of supplies daily just to survive: ammunition, rations, medical equipment, and considerably more during active combat operations. An army of 150,000 soldiers required more than 150 tons of supplies daily. Those supplies had to be loaded onto barges at French ports, transported across the Channel under the threat of British attack, unloaded onto improvised beachheads where there were no proper harbour facilities, and distributed to units in the field. If the Royal Navy, or even the Royal Air Force, managed to interrupt this supply line for more than a few days, the invasion force would be stranded without ammunition or food, forced either to surrender or to attempt a suicidal retreat across the Channel. German planners understood this vulnerability. Their estimates of supply requirements and the logistics to meet them painted a picture of an operation hanging by the thinnest possible thread. The ports available for embarkation created another practical nightmare. German invasion forces would have to launch from French Channel ports, primarily Cherbourg, Le Havre, Dieppe, and smaller harbours along the Norman coast. These ports had been damaged in the fighting or lacked the infrastructure to handle the unprecedented scale of what was being attempted. Cherbourg, the largest available port, could handle perhaps 15,000 tons of cargo per day under ideal conditions. To supply and reinforce an invasion army would require far more capacity than this. The alternative was to use open beaches or roadsteads, shallow water anchorages, where ships could anchor while their cargo was ferried ashore by small boats. This method was slower, more dangerous, and more vulnerable to disruption by British naval attack. There were no modern port facilities on the English side either, which meant invading forces would have to capture ports intact and secure them immediately, a difficult proposition when landing on a defended coast where British troops and local resistance could easily demolish dock infrastructure before retreating. German planners had experience capturing ports in France, but often those victories came after the ports had already been partially destroyed. A successful invasion of Britain would require not just breaking through beach defences, but immediately seizing functional ports. This had never been attempted on any large scale in the war so far. The weather and tidal factors added yet another layer of complexity to planning. The English Channel is notoriously difficult to navigate in fall and winter. Storms could appear with little warning, scattering invasion barges across the sea. Tides in the Channel run at speeds of up to 2 kilometers per hour, creating powerful currents that could sweep invasion forces off course. Fog was common, making coordination between invasion units extremely difficult. The Luftwaffe's role depended on clear visibility to provide air cover and to attack British naval forces attempting to interrupt the crossing. Once autumn arrived, the probability of extended periods of suitable weather dropped dramatically. This meant any invasion attempt had to be launched within a narrow window, roughly late July through September, when weather could be predicted with some reasonable confidence. Miss this window, and the operation would have to wait until the following spring, during which time British defences would only strengthen. German planners were acutely aware that they were racing against the calendar as well as against British military power. The casualty estimates emerging from German staff calculations were so horrifying that they were sometimes suppressed in official reports. Military theorists estimated that crossing the Channel under opposition would result in losses of between 30 and 50% of the invasion force before troops even reached the beach. Some pessimistic assessments reached even higher. These were not defeats sustained in battle. These were losses incurred simply in the act of crossing. Barges would be sunk by British naval gunfire or air attack. Soldiers crowded into slow, vulnerable vessels would drown if their transport was hit and sank. Officers calculated that a successful invasion might require the sacrifice of more men in the crossing alone than Germany had lost in the entire French campaign. This was the scale of the gamble. German commanders had become accustomed to rapid, victorious campaigns where losses were replaced by loot from conquered territories. An amphibious assault across the Channel would reverse that equation entirely. It would require Germany to spend an enormous amount of blood and material to gain what amounted to a foothold on a hostile coast, with no guarantee that the foothold could be expanded into a successful conquest. To some German generals, the arithmetic of Operation Sea Lion looked less like a military operation and more like a collective suicide pact. The British response to the threat of invasion added another dimension to German logistical nightmares. As reports filtered back from reconnaissance missions and captured intelligence, it became clear that Britain was not sitting passively behind its beaches waiting to be invaded. The Royal Navy was positioning ships and destroyers to concentrate against any invasion attempt. The Royal Air Force was training pilots specifically for anti-invasion duties. Coastal defences were being strengthened. Obstacles were being placed on beaches to impede landing craft. Anti-tank guns were being emplaced to defend against armour. The British Home Guard was mobilising to defend towns and villages. Every day that passed without a German invasion attempt meant British defensive preparations grew more sophisticated. The narrow window of opportunity that German planners had identified was not just closing due to weather, it was also closing because Britain was using every moment to strengthen its ability to resist. German intelligence reports, though sometimes inaccurate in detail, conveyed the essential truth. The longer invasion was delayed, the more formidable the opposition would become. The Luftwaffe's promise to achieve air superiority and keep British forces away from the landing zones was therefore not just desirable, but absolutely necessary. Without air cover, the invasion barges crossing the Channel would be slaughtered. The inter-service arguments over how to conduct an invasion revealed the depth of logistical desperation. The German army wanted a broad invasion front, with multiple landing sites spread across southern England from Cornwall to Sussex. Spreading out the invasion would allow the Wehrmacht to attack on multiple axes, overwhelming British defenders through sheer tactical diversity. But the German Navy, acutely aware of its inferiority to the Royal Navy, insisted that this was impossible. The Navy could not protect a broad front. It could barely protect a narrow corridor across the Channel. The Navy proposed a limited invasion, concentrated in a narrow zone near Dover or in the Straits, where the crossing would be shortest and where the Navy's limited forces might actually offer some protection. This would compress the invasion into a smaller, more vulnerable package. The Army and Navy positions were almost irreconcilable. The Army wanted a bold stroke that would spread British resistance thin. The Navy wanted a cautious, limited operation that minimized exposure to the Royal Navy. Neither service could force the other into agreement, and Hitler, increasingly impatient, demanded that they solve the problem without his direct intervention. The result was a series of compromise proposals that satisfied neither service and that became progressively less realistic as the weeks wore on. The conversion of fishing boats and inland barges into invasion transports was itself an engineering challenge that consumed enormous resources. Each vessel had to be modified to carry troops and equipment. Gun mounts had to be installed to provide some defensive firepower. Ramps or cargo nets had to be fitted to allow troops to disembark quickly once they reached the British coast. Commanding officers and navigators had to be assigned, often men who had no military training and whose only qualification was knowing how to operate their particular vessel. The Kriegsmarine struggled to find enough trained sailors to man the invasion flotilla. Some of the barges would have to be handled by civilian crews or by hastily conscripted sailors with minimal training. This created enormous risks. Inexperienced personnel handling slow, vulnerable vessels in narrow, dangerous waters during wartime was a recipe for disaster. Collisions between barges were a constant hazard during training exercises. Vessels were lost to accidents as often as to enemy action during the preparation phase. The organizational challenge of assembling, training, and preparing an improvised invasion fleet of 200 to 300 vessels was one that the Kriegsmarine had never attempted. By the time the barges had been gathered from across occupied Europe and transported to Channel ports, it was already early September. The invasion season was slipping away. The positioning of invasion forces in Channel ports created its own vulnerabilities and contradictions. The longer barges and transports remained loaded and ready in French ports, the longer they were exposed to British air attack. Photographs from reconnaissance missions showed British bombers exactly where the invasion fleet was concentrated. The RAF began bombing the assembly points, sinking barges, destroying supplies, and disrupting the careful logistical arrangements that German planners had put in place. But withdrawing the barges to less vulnerable positions meant dismantling the invasion readiness that had been achieved at such enormous cost. The vessels had to be scattered across multiple ports to reduce the impact of air attacks, but scattering them meant that reassembling them for a coherent invasion attempt would require additional time and effort. The barges could not remain indefinitely in their current state. Food provisions would rot, equipment would deteriorate. The troops crowded into the transports could not remain there for weeks without becoming demoralized and exhausted. Something had to happen soon. Either the invasion had to be launched, or the entire operation had to be abandoned. The logistics created a ticking clock that added psychological pressure to military pressure. The material impossibility of maintaining supply lines across the Channel, even after a successful initial landing, became clearer as planning progressed. German commanders calculated that the narrowest point of the Channel, the Straits of Dover, was roughly 30 kilometers wide at its widest. The sea route from French ports to southern English beaches was longer, sometimes covering between 40 and 60 kilometers depending on the exact landing site. A convoy of slow barges, even if protected by naval escorts and air cover, would require multiple hours to make the crossing. During those hours, German forces on the British side of the Channel would be cut off from immediate reinforcement and supply. The Royal Navy's response would be to concentrate its forces against any invasion attempt, attacking from multiple angles, attempting to sink transports and disrupt supply lines. German naval forces were too weak to reliably prevent this. The Luftwaffe would have to provide air cover, and the Luftwaffe's range and endurance were limited. Fighters could protect the crossing for a time, but sustained air cover across the entire crossing and for an extended period was beyond German capabilities. Every hour that supply lines were cut meant the invasion forces on the British coast were consuming ammunition and supplies without replacement. Within days, perhaps only within hours, an isolated invasion force would exhaust its ammunition and food, becoming unable to defend itself. The only way to prevent this was to seize ports immediately upon landing and use them as supply depots. But ports were heavily fortified, and capturing them would require a coordinated assault that was difficult to execute under any circumstances, much less during an opposed amphibious landing. The logistical circle became vicious and inescapable. By summer 1940, the full scope of the logistical challenge had become apparent to German military planners, and the consensus, though never explicitly stated by Hitler, was increasingly pessimistic. Operation Sea Lion was not impossible. It could theoretically have been conducted with proper preparation and favorable circumstances, but it was becoming clear that the preparation would require more time, more resources, and more naval strength than Germany possessed. The invasion barges gathered in French ports were vulnerable to air attack. The troops assigned to the invasion were needed elsewhere. The Luftwaffe was being bled white in the Battle of Britain. The Navy was too weak to provide meaningful protection. The Four Min say, in the spring of 1940, as German armies celebrated their conquest of France, a peculiar problem emerged within the Nazi military hierarchy. The Wehrmacht had mastered the art of rapid land conquest, crushing enemy defenses through coordinated blitzkrieg tactics that combined armor, infantry, and air support in devastating sequences. Yet the prospect of crossing the English Channel exposed a fundamental weakness. Germany possessed no unified command structure for amphibious operations, no shared doctrine, no institutional experience in projecting military power across water. The three service branches, the Army, the Navy, and the Luftwaffe, had evolved as separate fiefdoms, each with its own leadership, priorities, and strategic vision. When Hitler demanded that Britain be conquered, these institutions collided head-on, and their failure to agree on basic operational requirements would become one of the operation's fatal flaws. The German army, or Heer, approached invasion planning with the confidence born of uninterrupted success. German generals, who had demolished French defences in weeks, believed that subjugating Britain would follow a similar pattern. They envisioned a broad invasion front stretching across southern England, from Kent in the east to Dorset and beyond in the west. This wide deployment would prevent British forces from concentrating their defence at a single point, overwhelming them through sheer weight of numbers and speed. The army planned to land approximately 100,000 troops in the initial assault, with subsequent waves bringing the total occupation force to around 500,000 men within the first weeks. These figures derived not from careful logistical calculation, but from the army's conviction that Britain, like France, would crumble quickly once boots touched English soil and the machinery of German conquest began to turn. Senior commanders spoke with casual certainty about marching on London, capturing airfields, and consolidating control before British resistance could properly organise. This vision collided almost immediately with the harsh realities articulated by the Kriegsmarine, Germany's naval arm. The German Navy was already severely weakened from the Norwegian campaign just weeks prior, where it had suffered the loss of cruisers, destroyers, and other warships to British naval and air attacks. The remaining German fleet, a fraction of British naval strength, could not possibly protect an invasion fleet spread across a broad front. The Navy's commanding officer made the strategic mathematics brutally clear. With the forces available, Germany could protect only a narrow corridor of the Channel, perhaps between Dover and the Norman coast. Within this restricted passage, German warships could position themselves to offer some defense against British naval interference. Any broader invasion front would expose transport vessels and troop-laden barges to British destroyer and cruiser attacks that Germany lacked the power to prevent. The Navy therefore insisted that the army drastically reduce its invasion plans, accepting a concentrated assault on a narrow beach sector rather than the sweeping multi-front landing the generals desired. This disagreement reflected not merely different tactical preferences, but fundamentally incompatible visions of what German military power could actually accomplish. The confrontation between Army and Navy planners produced documents and meetings that grew increasingly tense as spring turned to summer. Army officers viewed the Navy's cautious assessments as defeatist, the complaints of a service branch that had always struggled with inferiority and now sought to limit its own exposure through timid strategy. The Navy, conversely, saw the Army's ambitions as delusional fantasies generated by generals who had never planned an amphibious operation and refused to acknowledge the specific vulnerabilities of moving forces across water against a hostile maritime enemy. Neither service possessed the institutional knowledge to convince the other of its position, because neither had true expertise in amphibious warfare. The German military had relied on speed and land conquest for so long that the very skills necessary for conducting large-scale water crossings under enemy fire had withered. Other nations, the Allies would later demonstrate, had developed specialized forces, doctrine, and equipment for amphibious operations. Germany had done none of this, and now, in the midst of war, both the army and navy were attempting to improvise solutions to problems they had never anticipated needing to solve. Into this fractious disagreement stepped Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, bearing a solution that promised to resolve both the strategic deadlock and Germany's underlying vulnerability. Göring was a political creature first, and a military commander second, a man whose proximity to Hitler had earned him extraordinary influence, despite mixed results in his actual wartime decisions. Göring claimed that the Luftwaffe could achieve absolute air superiority over southern England, creating a shield under which invasion forces could cross and consolidate without fear of British air attack. If the German Air Force could destroy the Royal Air Force, disable British airfields, and maintain German fighter dominance, then the entire question of naval inferiority became moot. British naval forces would not venture into waters where German aircraft could strike them freely. The Luftwaffe would become, in effect, the substitute for naval power that Germany lacked. This proposition appealed to Hitler, who had long underestimated the importance of naval warfare, and it temporarily unified the fractious military leadership behind the concept that destroying the RAF was the prerequisite for successful invasion. Göring's promise transformed the problem into one of air superiority, shifting the burden away from the Navy's inability to protect a broad front and toward the Luftwaffe's supposed capacity to neutralize British air power. Yet Göring's assurances obscured a critical miscalculation about both the capabilities of his own air force and the resilience of British air defences. The Luftwaffe had achieved remarkable success in France, establishing local air superiority through concentrated effort against a weaker, disorganized opponent. The RAF in 1940 was far tougher than the French Air Force. It possessed modern fighters, innovative radar detection systems, and pilots willing to accept enormous losses to prevent German domination. Moreover, the Luftwaffe's success in continental Europe had been achieved through short-range operations from nearby bases. Penetrating deep into English airspace meant longer sorties, reduced fuel capacity, and consequently reduced combat endurance. German fighter escorts could follow bombers only so far before needing to turn back to conserve fuel for the return journey, leaving bombers vulnerable to British fighters during the final portions of their approach and bombing runs. Göring either did not fully understand these limitations or chose to ignore them, preferring the political convenience of confident declarations to the strategic burden of honest assessment. His promise thus rested on an assumption that proved fundamentally false, that air power alone could neutralize naval inferiority and guarantee invasion success. The disagreement about strategy extended beyond the grand vision to encompass countless smaller questions about logistics, timing, and resource allocation. The army needed transport vessels, barges, and merchant ships to move invasion forces across the Channel. These resources existed in limited quantities and would take time to gather and prepare for military purposes. The Luftwaffe simultaneously demanded aircraft production, replacement pilots, and fuel supplies to conduct the sustained air campaign against Britain. The Navy required fuel, munitions, and crew assignments for the warships tasked with providing whatever protection they could muster for the crossing. Each service branch competed for finite German resources, and agreeing on which priorities should receive allocation meant accepting secondary status for one's own needs. No mechanism existed within the German military command structure to enforce inter-service cooperation or to compel agreement on resource distribution. Hitler himself, rather than establishing clear authority to resolve disputes, often allowed competing factions to argue their cases and then made decisions based on political considerations rather than military logic. By early summer of 1940, the original invasion concept had evolved into an awkward compromise that satisfied none of the service branches. The army accepted a narrower landing front, though reluctantly, recognizing that a broad assault was impossible without greater naval protection. The Navy agreed to provide protection for this narrower corridor, though it remained deeply skeptical about the entire operation's feasibility and continued to warn that invasion would likely result in catastrophic losses if the Luftwaffe failed to deliver air superiority. The Luftwaffe committed to the air campaign, but with implicit expectations that success would come relatively quickly, within weeks rather than months. This last assumption proved to be the operation's most dangerous illusion. The air battle against Britain would not conclude swiftly with the RAF neutralized and German fighters patrolling unopposed skies. Instead, the Luftwaffe would find itself locked in a prolonged, attritional struggle against an enemy that refused to be defeated through bombing campaigns and possessed superior capabilities for fighter defense. As the air battle intensified through the summer months, the underlying coordination problems between the service branches became only more acute. The fundamental issue was that no German officer held unambiguous authority over invasion planning. The army commanders prepared their assault plan. The Navy developed its protective strategy. The Luftwaffe pursued its air campaign. These three efforts were meant to occur simultaneously and in support of one another, yet they operated on different timelines, with different assumptions about what the other services could deliver, and with different measures of success. The army cared primarily about getting its forces ashore and establishing a lodgment on English soil. The Navy cared about minimizing losses to its already depleted fleet. The Luftwaffe cared about achieving air superiority, a goal that was as much about proving the independent power of air forces as about supporting invasion. When reality diverged from expectation, when the Luftwaffe failed to crush British resistance, when the air campaign proved longer and bloodier than anticipated, when German losses mounted without producing the promised strategic breakthrough, each service blamed the others for inadequate performance. The army complained that the Luftwaffe could not guarantee air superiority. The Luftwaffe responded that the Navy's refusal to protect a broad invasion front meant the army's plans were inherently unrealistic. The Navy maintained that it had warned from the beginning that invasion could not be safely attempted without genuine naval superiority that Germany simply did not possess. Throughout the late summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain reached its crescendo, this organizational dysfunction became increasingly evident in the mounting confusion about invasion readiness. Invasion barges continued to gather in French ports, loaded with supplies and troops, but the order to launch never seemed to arrive. Was invasion imminent or indefinitely postponed? Did the barges represent an actual threat or merely a bluff? British commanders and politicians genuinely could not determine whether Germany possessed the will and capability to attempt crossing the Channel. This uncertainty was itself a strategic effect. British resources remained mobilized, military production focused on defense, civilian population anxious and alert. Yet for Germany, this continued state of preparation without action was consuming resources, occupying troops who might be needed elsewhere, and ultimately pointing toward a decision that neither the Army, Navy, nor Luftwaffe wanted to voice explicitly. Operation Sea Lion, as originally conceived, had become impossible. The service branches could not agree on a unified plan. They could not agree on adequate resources for any plan they might jointly devise, and they could not agree on what constituted success. By October 1940, with autumn moving toward winter and the Luftwaffe still far from achieving air superiority, the invasion question had become politically and strategically untenable. No service commander was willing to declare the operation impossible, as such an admission would mean accepting blame for German failure. Instead, the decision to indefinitely postpone invasion was made by default, through a series of small delays and reschedulings that eventually amounted to cancellation without anyone formally announcing that Sea Lion was dead. The barges remained in French ports, a visual reminder of ambitions unrealized. The troops stayed mobilized, awaiting orders that would never come. The inter-service arguments about strategy and resources continued, as if genuine invasion remained possible, even as military planners quietly redirected resources toward new operations in the Balkans, and increasingly focused on the real objective that Hitler had adopted, the conquest of the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht's failure to develop unified command and doctrine for amphibious operations had not directly caused Germany's inability to invade Britain, but it had prevented the military from effectively attempting the operation when conditions were most favorable. The divided house, speaking in three different voices and unable to coordinate its ambitions with its capabilities, had allowed a possible moment to slip away into the category of road not taken. In the spring of 1940, as German armies swept across France and the prospect of invasion grew from theoretical alarm to imminent catastrophe, Britain faced a crisis that no amount of military hardware could solve alone. The nation's survival would depend not merely on guns and ships and radar stations, but on something far more fragile and far more powerful, the collective will of a people to resist. It was in this moment of maximum peril that a man emerged from the political shadows to speak with a voice that would reshape the war itself. Winston Spencer Churchill, who had warned against Nazi danger for years while others dismissed his concerns as warmongering, became Prime Minister on the 10th of May 1940. The same day, German panzer divisions crashed through the Dutch and Belgian borders. His appointment was not a triumph of popularity, but an act of desperation by a government that had exhausted all gentler options. Within weeks, as French resistance crumbled and the British Expeditionary Force scrambled toward Dunkirk in humiliating retreat, Churchill's government faced the first serious internal pressure to negotiate with Hitler. If Britain could not defeat Germany militarily, so the argument went, why not seek acceptable terms while the nation still retained some bargaining power? The alternative seemed to be slow strangulation, invasion, bombardment, economic collapse. But Churchill, in a series of speeches and broadcasts that would define both his legacy and British resolve, chose to reject that logic entirely. On the 4th of June 1940, with more than 300,000 British and Allied soldiers rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk, but their equipment abandoned and their army shattered, Churchill stood before Parliament and delivered words that seemed almost perverse in their refusal of reality. He acknowledged the catastrophe without flinching. He spoke of the equipment lost, the territory surrendered, the isolation of Britain. He did not promise quick victory or easy outcomes. But then, in a passage that would echo through the remainder of the war and into history itself, he declared that Britain would fight on, not because success was certain, but because surrender was unthinkable. "We shall go on to the end," he said. "We shall fight in France and on the seas and oceans. We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches and in the fields, and in the streets, and in the hills. He would never surrender. This was not propaganda in the crude sense, not false reassurance designed to deceive. Rather, it was something more sophisticated and more dangerous to Hitler's plans. It was rhetoric that acknowledged the gravity of the situation while refusing to accept its logical conclusion. Churchill did not tell the British people that victory was assured. He told them that surrender was impossible, and in that distinction lay the entire strategy of resistance. What made Churchill's speeches so effective was their fundamental honesty about the nature of the struggle. He did not minimize the threat of invasion or the devastation of bombing. He did not claim that the military situation was anything other than grave. But he reframed the terms of the conflict in ways that made submission seem not merely cowardly, but meaningless. A surrender to an enemy that would destroy Britain regardless of whether Britons fought or capitulated. If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, he declared. And so, while the military situation remained desperate, while barges assembled in Channel ports and German fighters dominated the daytime sky, Churchill's words created a psychological framework in which only one course of action made sense: to resist, to endure, to fight on until the nature of events changed, or until Britain itself was destroyed in the effort. This was the genius of his approach. He did not promise that resistance would succeed, but he made surrender seem like a kind of suicide, a voluntary descent into the darkness he warned against. The practical mechanics of Churchill's influence extended far beyond Parliament and the British public. Radio broadcasts, carried on the BBC's wireless transmitters, reached across the Channel into occupied Europe, where citizens under Nazi control listened to English voices speaking of defiance. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. In nations conquered by German arms, where local governments had accommodated themselves to Nazi rule or collaborated outright, the sound of the British Prime Minister refusing to surrender was a signal that resistance remained possible, that the war was not yet decided, that hope existed in the most unlikely place. Occupied France, conquered Poland, subjugated Belgium, all received signals that Britain fought on. This was propaganda in a real sense, but it was propaganda rooted in fact. Churchill was not lying when he said Britain would fight. He was genuinely committed to continuing the war. The speeches were thus simultaneously an expression of actual policy and a weapon of psychological warfare aimed at the German-dominated continent. Churchill understood intuitively what modern psychology would later confirm, that morale is not merely an emotional state, but a practical military factor. Armies that believe they will lose fight with less intensity and commitment than armies that believe they might win. Civilians under bombardment, who trust their leadership to maintain the struggle, respond differently than those who sense their leaders are considering capitulation. By refusing, with utter clarity and conviction, to even entertain the possibility of surrender, Churchill created a psychological reality that became self-fulfilling. The British people, hearing their Prime Minister's words, understood that no deal with Hitler was forthcoming, and from that understanding flowed a kind of calm acceptance of what must be endured. They would face invasion if it came. They would survive bombardment if they could, but they would not break, because their leadership had made breaking impossible, not through coercion, but through articulating a vision of national purpose that made surrender unthinkable. The speeches themselves became cultural events, transmitted by radio and then reprinted in newspapers, read aloud in homes and workplaces, memorized and repeated. In an era before television, the radio was the technology of mass communication, and Churchill used it with the precision of an artist. His voice, that growling, measured, deliberate delivery, became inseparable from the message itself. He did not speak in the rapid, urgent tones of a man in panic. He spoke slowly, deliberately, with the weight of each phrase seeming to carry the authority of history itself. When he said, "We shall never surrender," the British people did not hear the voice of a desperate politician grasping for psychological advantage. They heard the voice of their nation speaking to itself, choosing its own destiny. The effect was profound and immeasurable, yet it was also entirely real. It was not magic, but it was something close to it. The alchemy by which words, spoken with conviction at the moment of maximum danger, reshape the consciousness of millions. What Churchill also understood, and what made him different from many political leaders of his era, was that British people needed to be spoken to honestly about the nature of their peril. He did not hide the threat of invasion, or pretend that bombardment would be painless. Instead, he incorporated the danger into his narrative of resistance. The bombs will fall, the invasion might come, but we will endure, and in enduring, we will deny Hitler his victory. This honesty was essential to his credibility. Had Churchill promised that there would be no more bombing, no invasion threat, that Britain would be spared suffering, he would have been exposed as a liar within days. Instead, he acknowledged the worst while insisting that the worst would not break the nation's will. It was a subtle but crucial rhetorical move, to make the British people, in effect, a partner in the struggle, rather than a passive audience waiting for reassurance. The role of propaganda broadcasts, directed at occupied Europe and at Germany itself, was more explicitly manipulative, though no less important strategically. Messages transmitted back across the Channel suggested that Britain's position was stronger than it actually was, that German invasion plans were failing, that the Nazi regime was facing mounting difficulties. These messages were partially true. Britain's position was strengthening relative to earlier in the year. German invasion plans were in fact running into serious problems, and the Nazi regime did face genuine challenges. But the broadcasts also amplified these truths, presented them in the most favorable light, and suggested outcomes and timelines that were optimistic beyond what the current military situation warranted. From Germany's perspective, as Hitler and his military leadership received reports of British defiance and resistance, as German newspapers struggled to explain why the invasion had not yet occurred, the psychological weight of Churchill's speeches accumulated. The Nazi leadership had assumed that Britain, isolated and militarily defeated in France, would sue for peace. When Britain refused to do so, when the British people rallied around their Prime Minister's speeches rather than fracturing in panic, Germany's strategic plan began to unravel. The intersection of Churchill's words, the British people's response, and the failure of the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority created a feedback loop in which morale became tangible military force. As German pilots encountered fierce resistance from British fighters, as they were tracked by radar and intercepted with increasing precision, they returned to their bases in occupied France with reports of unexpected British strength. These reports seemed to contradict the assumption that Britain was already beaten. The contradiction bred uncertainty among German commanders. If Britain was truly defeated, why was it fighting on? The answer that emerged from German analysis was troubling. Britain was fighting on because it believed it could win, because its leadership had convinced the population that resistance was possible. From a military standpoint, this was irrational. Britain should have surrendered. The fact that it did not revealed that factors other than pure military calculus were determining events. Churchill's speeches also served a critical function in maintaining the internal cohesion of the British political system and military command structure. Had the Prime Minister wavered, had he signalled that surrender was thinkable, the government would have fragmented into competing factions, arguing about the best terms on which to negotiate. The military services might have given less than total commitment to the defense effort. Regional authorities might have considered local capitulation. Instead, Churchill's absolute refusal to entertain surrender provided a clear and unambiguous framework within which all British institutions operated. Everyone knew where the Prime Minister stood. Everyone understood that the war would continue regardless of military setback. This clarity, paradoxically, enabled greater operational efficiency and coordination than would have existed in an atmosphere of political uncertainty and debate about whether the war should even continue. The longer-term impact of Churchill's speeches extended well beyond 1940 and the invasion threat itself. As the war continued through the following years, as Britain endured bombing and awaited invasion and slowly mobilized for a long struggle against Nazi Germany, the speeches became a kind of foundational narrative for British resistance. They were quoted, repeated, and referenced in moments of subsequent difficulty. They provided a touchstone of national identity that separated those who supported the war effort from those who questioned it. To doubt the war meant, in a sense, to repudiate Churchill's speeches, to suggest that his vision of Britain's unconquerable will was false. This gave the speeches a kind of immortality. They shaped not just the immediate response to the invasion threat of 1940, but the entire British experience of the war itself. It is important to recognize that Churchill's defiance was not inevitably successful. Had Germany possessed superior invasion logistics, had the Luftwaffe actually achieved the air superiority it promised, had Hitler been willing to accept the casualties that an actual channel crossing would have required, the outcome might have been different regardless of British morale. Churchill's speeches could not stop an invasion if one came. They could not repair damaged ships or rebuild lost aircraft. But what they did accomplish was equally important. They prevented Britain from surrendering before the invasion attempt had even been made. They held the nation together through the summer of 1940, when the military situation was catastrophic. They created a psychological foundation on which successful resistance could be built. And perhaps most crucially, they demonstrated to the world watching from outside Britain that resistance to Nazi Germany was possible, that a people could choose defiance over accommodation, and that such a choice, though terrifying and uncertain, was the one that preserved human dignity. By autumn of 1940, as the invasion barges sat idle in their channel ports, and the Luftwaffe exhausted itself in the Battle of Britain, the question of whether Britain would surrender had been definitively answered. Not because the military situation had dramatically improved, though it had improved somewhat, but because Churchill had made surrender politically impossible. The nation had crossed a psychological threshold. The will to resist had crystallized into something harder than fear or doubt. When Hitler finally turned his attention eastward toward Russia, when he abandoned the invasion plans and diverted German resources to prepare for Operation Barbarossa, Britain did not change course. The trajectory that Churchill had set in those early speeches continued unaltered. The invasion threat faded, but British resistance endured. In the end, Churchill's defiance proved to be as consequential as any military victory, because it ensured that Britain would be present at the war's conclusion, ready to resist totalitarianism, and available to serve as a base from which Allied forces would eventually launch the liberation of Europe. By the autumn of 1940, the harbours and inland waterways of German-occupied France and Belgium had become a vast military depot unlike anything Europe had witnessed in centuries. From the ports of Calais to Rotterdam, from Cherbourg to Ostend, German engineers and military planners had assembled the largest invasion flotilla ever constructed for a single amphibious operation. Converted fishing boats lay alongside purpose-built barges. Ferries requisitioned from peacetime service sat heavy in the water, their decks crowded with supplies, ammunition, and the equipment of invasion. Slow transport vessels, designed for cargo rather than combat, floated in neat rows, waiting for an order that would send them across the channel toward the white cliffs of Dover. The sheer scale of the assemblage was staggering. Thousands upon thousands of vessels, each one a commitment of German industrial capacity, each one a statement of intent. Yet as October progressed and the autumn weather turned colder and more uncertain, the docks remained quiet. No general issued the command to cast off. No subordinate officer received the signal to begin final preparations for sailing. The invasion flotilla that had gathered with such purpose and expectation remained motionless, suspended in a state of military limbo that would gradually harden into indefinite postponement. The fundamental problem was brutally simple, however much German military planners tried to obscure it with optimistic language and technical discussions. Hermann Göring had promised to deliver air superiority over the Channel and southern England. The Luftwaffe had thrown its strength into the Battle of Britain throughout July, August, and September, engaging the Royal Air Force in combat that seemed at times to favour Germany, at other times to favour Britain, but which ultimately revealed itself as a stalemate neither side had anticipated. German fighter pilots, many of them veterans of operations in Poland and France, where the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies, found themselves engaged in a grinding war of attrition over territory they could not hold and against an enemy they could not decisively defeat. The British, by contrast, fought over their own country. A pilot shot down and captured by the British represented a permanent loss to the Luftwaffe. A British pilot shot down over England might survive, bail out, and return to combat within days or weeks. This asymmetry of geography and consequence gradually wore away German pilot reserves at a rate that training schools could not replenish. The promised air superiority, the essential precondition for any invasion attempt, had simply failed to materialize. The German Navy had warned from the beginning that invasion without air superiority was impossible. Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander of the Kriegsmarine, had made this position clear in his discussions with Hitler during the summer months. The Royal Navy, despite losses suffered during the Norway campaign and other operations, remained vastly superior to German naval forces. A German invasion fleet caught in the Channel by British warships, unprotected by air cover, would be systematically destroyed. Raeder understood naval power in terms that his political leader sometimes seemed unwilling to accept. The Navy could protect a narrow invasion corridor, perhaps enough for forces to cross during daylight hours, but only if the Luftwaffe could guarantee that no British aircraft or ships would be permitted to interfere. Without such protection, any attempt to send slow, vulnerable transport vessels across the water would result in catastrophic losses. The Navy could not accept responsibility for such a gamble. By October, as summer transitioned toward autumn, Raeder's position hardened into absolute refusal. No invasion could proceed without the air superiority that Göring had promised and failed to deliver. Hitler found himself confronted with a strategic impasse that no amount of will or rhetoric could overcome. The leader who had defeated France in weeks, who had forced the British to evacuate their forces at Dunkirk, who had stood at the threshold of complete domination over Western Europe, now faced an enemy he could not immediately defeat and an invasion he could not immediately execute. He had surrounded himself with military advisors who told him what he wanted to hear, yet the fundamental facts remained unchanged. The Luftwaffe could not achieve air superiority. The Navy could not guarantee safe passage across the Channel. The army wanted to invade, but not under conditions that would lead to catastrophic losses. The convergence of these obstacles left no clear path forward. Hitler began to speak of delay rather than cancellation. He ordered preparations to continue, but pushed the launch date backward month by month. By late October, invasion had shifted from an operation planned for early autumn to one postponed until spring. The language of postponement carried with it the implicit assumption that the operation might yet proceed, but the reality of German military limitations made such optimism increasingly difficult to sustain. What neither Hitler nor his immediate circle seemed fully prepared to acknowledge was that the moment of maximum German advantage was passing. Germany had achieved its greatest relative superiority over Britain at the moment of France's fall. At that point, German forces were at their peak, their industry could focus on invasion preparation, and Britain was at its most vulnerable, lacking allies and facing the prospect of isolation. As autumn turned to winter, the situation did not improve, it only grew more complicated. The longer the invasion was postponed, the more time Britain had to prepare defences, to repair aircraft, and rebuild pilot training programs, to accumulate supplies and strengthen the resolve of the civilian population. Furthermore, Hitler's strategic attention was increasingly being drawn toward the Soviet Union. Intelligence reports spoke of Soviet military buildup. German military planners had begun to discuss operations in the East, to imagine the conquest of Russia and the securing of living space for German settlement. These conversations, conducted in secret and in the highest councils of the Third Reich, represented a fundamental reorientation of German strategic ambitions, away from completing the conquest of Western Europe and toward the seizure of territory in the East. The barges remained in the Channel ports throughout the autumn, a visible symbol of German power and German indecision. German soldiers stood guard over the vessels, watching the water, maintaining equipment that might never be used. British reconnaissance aircraft occasionally photographed the flotillas, and these photographs were circulated to British military leaders and politicians as evidence of the continuing invasion threat. The sight of so many German vessels gathered in ports just across the Channel from British territory kept the island nation alert, kept resources devoted to coastal defences and air raid precautions, kept the population living in a state of partial siege. Yet within German command, the understanding grew that these barges represented not the vanguard of an imminent invasion, but rather the symbol of a strategic failure. The massive investment in transport vessels and landing equipment would eventually be repurposed, scrapped, or abandoned as German strategy shifted toward Russia. For now, however, they remained where they had been gathered, neither launched in triumph nor dismantled in admission of defeat, but simply waiting in a kind of military purgatory. The weather also played its role in hardening the transition from postponement to permanent cancellation, though this factor was never the primary cause of the operation's abandonment. October brought the first chill winds and shorter daylight hours to the Channel. November would bring more severe weather, shorter days still, and increasingly rough seas. Winter conditions would make any amphibious operation far more hazardous than one launched in summer. Experienced naval officers and military planners understood that attempting to cross the Channel with slow, vulnerable transports during winter would be more dangerous than attempting it during calm summer weather. The argument for waiting until spring was therefore both a face-saving device and a practical acknowledgement of military reality. Spring, however, was months away, and much could change in those intervening months. In fact, everything would change. By the time spring came, German strategic attention would be almost entirely focused on Russia. The equipment gathered for invasion would be diverted to other uses. The soldiers trained and equipped for amphibious assault would be reassigned to panzer divisions and infantry units, preparing for operations in the east. Hitler's postponement of Sea Lion was never formally announced as a cancellation. No official statement declared that the operation had been abandoned and would never be attempted. Instead, the decision emerged gradually through a series of delayed launch dates, quietly shifted timelines, and the gradual diversion of resources to other theaters and other operations. This ambiguity served a political purpose. By never formally cancelling the operation, Hitler preserved the fiction that Germany could still invade Britain if circumstances changed. This maintained pressure on the British, continued to tie down military resources and civilian attention in Britain, and served as a psychological assertion that Germany's power remained undiminished and that Britain's future remained uncertain. Yet within the German military and political establishment, the understanding was clear that invasion was no longer possible and would not be attempted. The Navy had said so with unmistakable clarity. The Luftwaffe could not deliver what Goering had promised. The army wanted assurances that could not be given. The leader of the Third Reich, confronted with an impasse, had chosen to look elsewhere. The shift in Hitler's attention toward Russia was not accidental or sudden, nor was it a complete surprise to observers at the time. German ideological documents, party programs, and Hitler's own writings had long identified the Soviet Union as the fundamental enemy. The conquest of Russian territory and the domination of Russian peoples had been a core element of Nazi ideology from the movement's inception. The Non-Aggression Pact, signed with Stalin in 1939, had been a tactical necessity, a way to secure Germany's eastern border while the Wehrmacht dealt with enemies in the west. But that pact had always been understood within German leadership as temporary. The opportunity to dominate the continent had to be completed before attention could turn east, and yet no such completion seemed possible while Britain remained unconquered and the war continued. Hitler's solution was to attempt both simultaneously, to maintain the fiction of eventual invasion of Britain while secretly planning the conquest of Russia. This splitting of strategic attention would prove catastrophic, yet in the autumn of 1940 it seemed a plausible way for Hitler to break the strategic stalemate that had developed. As October passed into November, and the barges remained unmoved in the harbours, German engineers and military planners quietly began to shift their focus to other tasks. Some of the invasion vessels would eventually be converted to other purposes. Some would be damaged or destroyed by British air and sea attacks on the ports where they were gathered. Others would simply be mothballed or scrapped as they became obsolete and as German military production focused on tanks, aircraft, and the equipment necessary for a massive land campaign in Russia. The officers who had spent months studying the logistics of invasion would be reassigned to staff positions supporting operations in the east. The moment when invasion might have been possible was passing, and with it was passing the realistic opportunity for Germany to achieve complete domination of Europe through the seizure of the British Isles. The Channel, which had protected Britain from invaders for centuries, had done so again. Geography and German strategic overreach combined to produce a stalemate that would, within a year, transform into a reversal of fortune as Germany committed itself to the vast and ultimately unsustainable campaign of conquest in the Soviet Union. The psychological impact of the postponement was significant in its own way, though less visible than military operations and less dramatic than the bomb raids that continued to fall on British cities. For the British population, the continued assembly of invasion vessels in ports across the Channel served as a reminder that the threat remained real, that the war was not over, that British victory was not assured. This pressure, maintained by the mere existence of the flotillas and the continued threat they represented served to keep Britain mobilized and alert. For the German population, by contrast, the knowledge that invasion had been postponed indefinitely represented a subtle acknowledgement that the quick victory Hitler had promised would not be forthcoming. The Blitzkrieg had succeeded in Poland and France, but it had failed in the air over Britain. Germany was beginning to settle into a longer conflict than had been anticipated, one that would require sustained industrial effort and military commitment over months or years rather than weeks or days. This transition from rapid victory to prolonged conflict would gradually reshape German society, the German economy, and ultimately German strategy. By the time the year 1940 ended and 1941 began, Operation Sea Lion had become what it would remain throughout the rest of the war. A historical might have been, a moment when circumstances might have aligned differently, and history might have taken a very different course. The barges sat in the harbours as a physical reminder of this unrealized possibility. The soldiers trained for the operation would serve in other capacities. The plans drawn up by the General Staff would be filed away and eventually forgotten. Yet the memory of the moment when invasion seemed possible, when the German military had gathered its forces and prepared to strike across the Channel, would persist in British consciousness and in historical memory. The invasion that never sailed would eventually become as important to the history of the Second World War as any invasion that actually occurred, not because of what happened, but because of what did not happen and how the failure to achieve it redirected the entire course of the conflict toward new theatres, new strategies, and ultimately toward Germany's defeat. While the invasion barges sat idle in French and Belgian harbours, their hulls gathering rust and their crews growing restless, Adolf Hitler's mind had already crossed the Channel and travelled far beyond Britain's shores. The Luftwaffe's failure to crush the Royal Air Force, though not yet publicly acknowledged, had begun to crystallise in Hitler's strategic thinking. The eastern frontier beckoned with a promise far greater than any British prize could offer. The Soviet Union represented not merely another military objective, but the culmination of Nazi ideology itself, the vast territorial expanse needed to fuel German dominion for 1,000 years, the Lebensraum that had animated Hitler's vision since his earliest political writings. In the autumn of 1940, even as German planners debated the logistics of crossing 80 kilometers of hostile water, their leaders' ambitions had already consumed a far grander prize, the subjugation of an empire that stretched across 11 time zones. The relationship between Hitler and Stalin had always been built on contempt and calculation, rather than any semblance of genuine accord. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, that shocking treaty that had stunned the world and freed Hitler to invade Poland, was a marriage of convenience between ideological enemies, each waiting for the moment when the other's guard would slip. Hitler had never abandoned his visceral hatred of communism or his conviction that Slavic peoples were biologically inferior, destined either for subjugation or extermination. The pact merely postponed the inevitable reckoning. Stalin, for his part, had viewed the agreement as a reprieve, a chance to strengthen Soviet defenses and prepare for the eventual German assault that he too knew was coming. By 1940, with Germany ascendant across Western Europe and Britain isolated, the pretense of partnership had become unbearable to Hitler. The Soviet Union appeared vulnerable, militarily weakened by Stalin's purges of the 1930s that had decimated the officer corps, economically dependent on trade that Germany could now dictate. To Hitler's mind, the moment for annihilation had arrived. The strategic reasoning, from Hitler's perspective, possessed a terrible logic. Britain remained undefeated, yes, But Britain was a secondary concern compared to the ideological and territorial imperative driving eastward. A German victory in the east would establish the resource base and the territorial foundation that would make eventual British submission inevitable. The Soviet Union possessed the oil fields that Germany desperately needed, the wheat and minerals that could sustain German autarky, and the vast eastern territories where the Aryan race could expand and consolidate power. Unlike the narrow channel that protected Britain from invasion, the eastern frontier lay open, vast, and seemingly conquerable through the conventional military means at Germany's disposal. More fundamentally, Hitler believed that German military superiority was greatest when applied decisively and with overwhelming force. Delay and dispersal of effort played to his enemy's strengths. By this reasoning, the correct strategy was to destroy the Soviet Union quickly, while German military advantage remained supreme, then turn with consolidated strength against the remaining enemies. The logic was seductive and catastrophic in equal measure. Throughout autumn and winter of 1940, while the Sea Lion invasion fleet continued to gather in Channel ports with no invasion date in sight, German military planners began receiving directives of a far different character. High-ranking Wehrmacht officers were summoned to secret briefings, where they learned of a forthcoming operation of unprecedented scale against the Soviet Union. The planning began not in public forums, but in carefully guarded military headquarters, where maps of Soviet territory were spread across tables and vast armies were imagined into being on paper. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, began compiling a plan that would require the mobilization of more than 3 million troops, a concentration of military force that dwarfed any previous German operation. The scope was staggering, the ambition was boundless. Yet the planners shared a critical assumption. The Soviet Union would collapse within a matter of weeks, perhaps a few months at most. This assumption was built on Germany's victories over France and Poland, on the belief that mechanized warfare had transformed military competition into a contest of speed and technical superiority rather than industrial capacity and staying power. The Soviet Union, with its vast distances and primitive supply lines, would surely crumble before German blitzkrieg tactics. Few planners entertained the possibility that the calculations might be catastrophically wrong. Hitler formalized his intentions in a directive issued on the 18th of December 1940. The document, known as Directive No. 21, and given the codename Operation Barbarossa, laid out the framework for the largest military operation in human history. The invasion would commence in the spring of 1941, after the muddy season had passed and the roads had hardened. German forces would be divided into 3 massive army groups, striking north toward Leningrad, south toward the Black Sea, and center toward Moscow itself. The objective was not merely to capture territory, but to achieve the complete annihilation of Soviet military capacity and Soviet state power. The directive spoke of a war of annihilation, a Vernichtungskrieg, where the conventional rules of warfare would not apply. This was not a war of conquest in the traditional sense, but a racial and ideological struggle whose outcome would determine whether Aryans or Slavs would dominate Europe. The language was unprecedented in its clarity about the totality of German intentions. The dual strategic commitment, maintaining the fiction of Sea Lion readiness while secretly preparing Barbarossa, imposed an enormous strain on German industrial and military capacity. Every factory that produced invasion barges could instead have manufactured aircraft for the Eastern Campaign. Every soldier assigned to standing alert for the Channel crossing could instead be training for the vast distances of Soviet territory. The Luftwaffe, already exhausted from the Battle of Britain, and suffering irreplaceable losses of experienced pilots, was simultaneously preparing for a massive air war in the east, while maintaining the appearance of readiness for operations across the Channel. The Navy, undermanned and overextended, had to garrison the western coast, while simultaneously supporting preparations for operations that would require air and ground superiority far from any ocean. The strain was not merely logistical but strategic. Germany was attempting to maintain two massive military postures simultaneously, preparing for two completely different wars in two completely different theaters. This divided focus meant that neither operation received the resources that success would have demanded. What was particularly revealing about this strategic confusion was the extent to which it remained hidden from the German military leadership's own understanding of German capacity. Hitler issued orders, and the General Staff obeyed, translating them into operational plans without necessarily confronting the fundamental contradiction inherent in the strategy. It was easier to plan conquests than to acknowledge that Germany lacked the industrial base to sustain them. German military planning had always relied on winning quickly, on achieving victory before the industrial superiority of potential enemies could be brought to bear. This doctrine had succeeded in Poland and France, where rapid campaigns overwhelmed opponents before they could fully mobilize. But the doctrine was approaching the limits of its applicability. The Soviet Union was incomparably larger than France, its population vastly greater, its territory almost inconceivably vast. A quick victory remained possible in German military theory, but the margin for error had shrunk to nearly nothing. There could be no prolonged struggle of attrition. Germany would lose such a contest. The entire strategic edifice of Barbarossa rested on the assumption that Soviet collapse would come before German resources were exhausted. The secrecy surrounding Barbarossa was elaborate and extensive, even as invasion barges remained stationed in the Channel, creating the appearance of continued sea lion preparation. The German military was engaged in the largest deception operation in human history. Troops were being transferred from France to eastern staging areas under the cover of normal garrison rotation. Aircraft were being repositioned eastward in ones and twos rather than in mass formations that might reveal the scale of preparation. Railway networks in Poland and eastern Germany were being expanded to accommodate an invasion force that would ultimately number in the millions. Soviet intelligence reported these preparations, and Stalin received warnings from multiple sources, yet he remained convinced that Germany would not attack until 1942 at the earliest, after consolidating victory in the West. Hitler's strategic decision was therefore being implemented without the Soviet Union fully grasping its timeline or magnitude until the invasion actually began. The intelligence gap, the miscalculation, and the overconfidence on both sides would merge into one of history's most catastrophic conflicts. The invasion barges in the Channel became a strategic artifact, a reminder of abandoned hopes or deferred ambitions. The German Navy had never wanted them, had always insisted that invasion was impossible without air superiority, that the Luftwaffe could not deliver. Yet the barges remained, because to dismantle them was to admit defeat, to acknowledge that Sea Lion would never happen. They consumed resources, attracted British air attack, and tied down German forces that were desperately needed elsewhere. By early 1941, German logistical planners were engaged in the grim calculus of maintaining an invasion that was not going to occur while preparing for a far larger war that was about to commence. The barges became symbols of the gap between Hitler's ambitions and Germany's actual capacity to achieve them, monuments to strategic overreach constructed from concrete and steel. They would eventually be scrapped or repurposed, but in the meantime, They represented the extraordinary split in German strategic focus during the final months before Barbarossa. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, made while Sea Lion remained technically possible and the invasion forces were positioned and prepared, reveals the fundamental nature of Nazi strategy and its tragic flaw. The decision was not made because Germany had conquered the West. It was made because Germany had failed to conquer Britain. The failure over Britain, instead of prompting a reassessment of German strategic overreach, instead prompted a doubling down on ambition. The Channel had proven too wide to cross without air superiority. The solution, in Hitler's mind, was not to consolidate, but to seek air superiority through expansion of air power, which would occur through the conquest of Soviet territory and resources. The logic was circular and self-defeating, but it was the only logic that allowed Hitler to preserve his self-image as an unchallenged military genius. Retreat was psychologically impossible for him. Redirection was the only acceptable response to setback. Thus, even as the Battle of Britain reached its climax in the autumn of 1940, Hitler was already moving past that struggle towards something even grander and more destructive. The fundamental miscalculation that animated Operation Barbarossa was that Germany possessed the capacity to undertake two major military operations in opposite directions simultaneously. The resources required for Sea Lion were not inconsiderable, even if the operation was ultimately not executed. The resources required for Barbarossa were almost inconceivably vast. Together, they exceeded what German industry could produce, what German manpower could supply, and what German logistics could sustain. A rational strategic analysis would have forced Hitler to choose one objective or the other: destroy Britain first, consolidate Western Europe, then turn east with full force against the Soviet Union, or abandon the idea of invading Britain, accept the continued existence of a British enemy as a long-term problem, and concentrate all German resources on the conquest of the Soviet Union. But Hitler was incapable of such rational choice. His self-conviction that willpower could overcome material obstacles drove him to attempt both, to maintain the pretense of Sea Lion readiness while secretly preparing the greatest military assault in history. The result was a dilution of German effort that would ultimately prove fatal. A strategic overreach that would destroy German power not on the beaches of England, but in the vast steppes east of Poland. By the spring of 1941, the transformation was complete. The invasion flotilla in the Channel would never sail. The soldiers who had trained for amphibious assault were now being loaded onto trains and transported eastward. The aircraft that had fought the Battle of Britain were being refitted and reassigned to ground support operations in preparation for the assault on the Soviet Union. The strategic center of gravity of the German military had shifted irrevocably from west to east. Operation Sea Lion, which had seemed at times like an imminent reality, would be formally cancelled only in long after-action reports and memoirs written in captivity or exile. It would never be cancelled by Hitler. It would simply be abandoned for something larger and more ambitious, a new obsession that would consume German strategic thinking with the same fervor that had once animated dreams of invading across the Channel. The English Channel would remain unviolated, not because it was uncrossable, but because Germany had chosen to attempt something even more impossible: the conquest of Russia, a task that would consume German military power until it was utterly exhausted, leaving Britain not defeated but vindicated, alone but ultimately surviving the greatest onslaught she had faced in centuries. As the leaves turned gold across northern France in the autumn of 1940, the mood in German military headquarters shifted from anticipation towards something far more ambiguous. The invasion barges that had been assembled with such urgency in Channel ports, slow, ungainly vessels designed for cargo rather than combat, sat idle in waters that grew colder by the week. The German military machine, accustomed to rapid victory and perpetual forward momentum, found itself frozen in an impossible posture, committed to an operation that could not proceed, yet unable to fully abandon it. Officers and enlisted men alike recognized the strategic contradiction that now defined their existence. They were soldiers prepared for invasion who would never invade, manning equipment in hostile waters with no clear purpose, no timeline, and no certainty about what command intended. The very concept of sea lion, once vibrant with possibility and terror, began to transform into something else entirely, a phantom operation, feared more in imagination than in practice, yet consuming vast resources and occupying critical thinking that might have been directed elsewhere. The fundamental problem was one of climate and physics that no amount of Nazi determination could overcome. The English Channel in winter becomes a grinding obstacle, its waters unpredictable and brutal. Autumn squalls arrive with increasing frequency, bringing waves that would swamp the invasion barges within minutes of launching. German planners had always known this limitation, but knowledge and acceptance are different things. By November 1940, the weather window that might have permitted invasion had definitively closed. Any attempt to cross the Channel in the months ahead would be not merely risky but suicidal. The barges lacked the seaworthiness to handle rough seas, and the supporting naval vessels would be scattered and vulnerable. Hitler faced a choice that his earlier successes had never prepared him to contemplate: acknowledge failure or maintain the pretense of readiness through the winter months. He chose the latter, a decision that would reveal the difference between tactical flexibility and strategic stubbornness. The invasion flotilla remained in its harbours, a monument to ambition deferred rather than abandoned. In the British coastal towns and across the southern shore of England, anxiety about invasion persisted even as military intelligence gradually clarified that the immediate danger had passed. The psychological shroud of sea lion extended far beyond its practical feasibility. Civilians who had prepared for the arrival of German troops did not suddenly relax their vigilance or dismantle their defenses because the weather had turned cold. The Home Guard continued its training with undiminished intensity. Anti-invasion obstacles remained embedded in beaches and fields. Barbed wire still lined the coast. Mothers still reminded their children which routes to follow if Germans landed. The threat had become diffuse, less about an imminent date certain, and more about a persistent danger that could theoretically resume when spring returned. This prolonged uncertainty may have been more psychologically taxing than a clear decision would have been, because it maintained the population in a state of readiness, without the catharsis of actual engagement or the comfort of knowing the danger had truly passed. The question of what to do with the invasion fleet itself presented German planners with a problem that revealed the instability at the heart of their grand strategy. The barges could not simply remain in port indefinitely. They required constant maintenance, guard, and supply. They occupied harbour space that merchant and military vessels needed. They consumed fuel, timber, rope, and countless other materials in their preservation. More significantly, they presented an irresistible target for British air and naval attack. The Royal Air Force, no longer struggling for survival as it had during the summer and early autumn, now possessed the tactical freedom to attack German shipping concentrations at will. British torpedo bombers and fighter bombers conducted raids on the invasion ports with increasing frequency, and each successful strike killed sailors, damaged vessels, and destroyed supplies. The German Navy protested the vulnerability of its ships and argued with increasing shrillness that the barges and transports remained exposed to unacceptable risk. Yet the army, which had been designated to conduct the invasion, resisted any order to disperse or dismantle the flotilla. To disperse it would be to acknowledge that invasion was truly postponed rather than merely delayed. To dismantle it would be to reverse months of preparation and to admit that the entire operation had collapsed. So the barges remained, sitting ducks in their harbors, targets that grew more valuable as strategic symbols than as actual invasion vessels. The human cost of this stalemate was measured not in blood spilled but in morale corroded and lives disrupted. Soldiers assigned to the invasion divisions waited through autumn and into winter with no certainty about their future. Some had been in their assembly areas for months, their training constantly repeated but never tested. Rumors circulated through the ranks. Would the invasion come in spring? Had it been cancelled without announcement? Were they being transferred east toward Russia? The uncertainty bred frustration, and frustration bred the kind of discipline problems that manifest in armies that lack clear purpose. Meanwhile, the ports themselves became increasingly dangerous places to work or be stationed. British bombing raids intensified as the season progressed, and the crews maintaining the invasion fleet faced daily danger without the purpose that comes from active combat. A mechanic repairing an engine in a barge moored in a French harbour was at risk from British bombs, but had no clarity about whether his work served a real strategic objective or merely maintained an elaborate fiction for the benefit of commanders unable to admit that their grand vision had collapsed. In Berlin, the split between the German military services widened rather than narrowed as winter approached. Hitler convened conferences where the army, navy, and Luftwaffe presented their conflicting assessments of Sea Lion's viability. The navy remained adamant that invasion was impossible without air superiority, and the Luftwaffe had manifestly failed to achieve it. The army, whose commanders harbored their own doubts, but who would not voice them directly to Hitler, argued that preparations must continue. Meanwhile, Hitler himself was increasingly distracted by a far larger ambition that had taken shape in his mind: the invasion of the Soviet Union. Planning for Operation Barbarossa proceeded in secret, consuming the time and attention of the military high command. The dual preparation, maintaining the pretense of readiness for Sea Lion while simultaneously planning the greatest invasion in military history, stretched German administrative and military capacity to its breaking point. Officers worked simultaneously on two contradictory strategic plans, and the lack of clarity about which would take priority poisoned the planning process for both. The turning point came not with a formal decision, but rather through a gradual shift in Hitler's public and private statements about the invasion timetable. In the autumn, Hitler still spoke of crossing the Channel as a matter of near-term necessity. By late autumn, his language had become more equivocal. The invasion might proceed when conditions were favorable, he suggested. The Luftwaffe must achieve air superiority first, he insisted, though everyone understood that hope was fading. By December 1940, military planners and political observers understood clearly that Sea Lion had been shelved, though no official announcement was made. The fiction that the operation remained viable was maintained for psychological and propaganda purposes, but the operational reality was that Germany had moved on. The barges would remain in their harbours, the troops would eventually be reassigned, and the plans would gather dust. Yet because no formal cancellation order was ever issued, the operation existed in a peculiar limbo, officially still planned, practically abandoned, neither one thing nor another. The irony of the stalemate became increasingly apparent as winter settled in. Germany had conquered France in weeks through speed and surprise. Hitler had expected to conquer Britain through similar means. Instead, Germany found itself in the position that every continental military power fears, bogged down in a peripheral operation with no clear path to victory and mounting opportunity costs. The very narrowness of the English Channel, which had been Britain's protection for centuries, now became a barrier that Germany could neither overcome nor abandon. The naval inferiority that Hitler had always known would be a problem had proven insurmountable. The air superiority that Goering had confidently promised had failed to materialize. The logistical challenges that military planners had only partially grasped had revealed themselves in all their terrible complexity. And the broader strategic context had shifted. Russia loomed now as the ideological enemy that Hitler was determined to destroy, and the resources that might have gone to perfect an invasion of Britain were needed for the even greater task of confronting Soviet communism. The myth of Sea Lion, the invasion that nearly happened, the moment when Britain nearly fell, the operation that might have changed the world, would be born partly from this very ambiguity. Historians and propagandists would later magnify the threat, describing German invasion as a near-certain catastrophe that had been narrowly averted. British civilians who had lived through the summer and autumn would describe their fear and preparation as responses to an existential danger. German veterans would hint at roads not taken, at strategic possibilities that had been squandered. But the truth, visible only in the winter months when weather made invasion impossible and Hitler's attention had turned to Russia, was far more complex. Sea Lion had never been truly possible once British radar and pilot endurance had prevented the Luftwaffe from gaining air superiority. The operation was unexecutable not because of bad luck or bad timing, but because the Germans lacked the fundamental prerequisites for success. Yet by remaining in the ports through the winter, not formally cancelled, but practically abandoned, the invasion flotilla maintained the appearance of threat long after the reality had evaporated. As the new year 1941 approached, the question of what would happen to the invasion barges and the troops assembled to cross the Channel became increasingly urgent. The resources could not be left idle indefinitely. The ships needed either to be committed to their original purpose or to be redirected to support other operations. The soldiers needed either to be trained for invasion or to be reassigned to other theaters. The fantasy of Sea Lion could not be maintained forever. Eventually, the fiction would have to be officially abandoned or transformed into something else. German High Command faced the necessity of making a strategic choice that should have been made months earlier: commit fully to invasion in spring 1941, or formally acknowledge that the operation had been shelved and redirect all resources toward the planned campaign in Russia. Hitler's preference was becoming clear, though he would not state it openly. The Eastern adventure called to him with a force that the invasion of Britain could no longer match. Barbarossa represented not merely military victory, but ideological transformation, the conquest of living space that would secure Germany's future for 1,000 years. Sea Lion, by contrast, represented merely the completion of the conquest of Western Europe, the elimination of one last enemy. The scale and scope of the Russian campaign made the invasion of Britain seem like a minor operation by comparison. The transition from autumn to winter in 1940 thus marks a crucial inflection point in the war that is often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic moments of summer's aerial combat. The moment when Germany was forced to admit that it could not immediately invade Britain is the moment when the strategic initiative began to slip from Nazi hands. The operational pause required by winter weather became a strategic pause, which became a strategic surrender. The the barges remained, silent witnesses to ambition that had exceeded Germany's capacity to execute. The troops stayed in their assembly areas, increasingly uncertain about their future. The invasion that would never come was transformed from an imminent threat into a phantom danger, from a possible outcome into an alternative history that would eventually seem almost unthinkable. And in Berlin, the focus of the highest command shifted irrevocably toward the east, toward the vast spaces of Russia, where Hitler believed the true struggle for German survival would be decided. The English Channel had not been crossed, not because it could not be crossed, but because Germany could not marshal the resources and coordination necessary to do it before the weather made the attempt suicidal. That failure, disguised by inaction and unclear language, was the hinge upon which the entire war would turn. The winter stalemate thus represents something that military history often underestimates: the power of what is not done, the significance of what is not said, the weight of decisions deferred. By not invading Britain when invasion was still barely possible, Germany had chosen, though it did not fully acknowledge the choice, to attempt a different kind of conquest. The barges in the harbours, the troops in their assembly areas, the equipment carefully maintained against future need. All of these would eventually be repurposed, redirected, and forgotten. But in that winter of 1940 turning into 1941, they represented the ghost of an operation that had died not in dramatic failure, but in bureaucratic postponement. Sea Lion was never formally cancelled, never subject to a clear command from Hitler stating that the invasion would not proceed. Instead, it simply faded, like a photograph left in sunlight, becoming less vivid with each passing week, until it was no longer the center of German strategic planning. The channel that had protected Britain for 1,000 years would protect it still, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the simple passage of time and the changing priorities of an enemy that had overestimated its capacity and underestimated the cost of simultaneous multiple strategic ambitions. In the decades following the Second World War, historians and military strategists have turned Operation Sea Lion inside out, examining it not as the invasion that was, but as the invasion that might have been. The question haunts the corridors of military academies and the pages of scholarly debate. Could Germany have succeeded if different decisions had been made at critical junctures? The answer, frustratingly for those seeking neat historical closure, is that success remained tantalizingly possible, yet fundamentally improbable. To understand why requires us to strip away hindsight and examine the specific choices that shaped Germany's fate, revealing a command structure fundamentally incapable of the coordination and restraint that invasion demanded. The first and most obvious alternative turns on the matter of dedicated landing craft. Germany entered 1940 without a single purpose-built amphibious vessel in its inventory, a startling gap in military preparation for a nation that had just conquered France and stood poised to cross the Channel. The British, by contrast, would spend the next 4 years developing the Higgins boats, the landing ship tank, and other specialized vessels that would make the Normandy landings of 1944 technically feasible. A Germany that had begun production of dedicated landing craft in 1938 or 39 would have possessed by 1940 a fleet capable of rapid, protected crossings and beach assaults. Such vessels could have carried troops with armor support, reduced casualties during the crossing itself, and enabled multiple waves of reinforcement across a broader invasion front. The logistical nightmare that consumed German planning meetings might have transformed into difficult but surmountable problems of supply and rotation. Yet this alternative requires us to imagine a German military establishment with different priorities entirely. One that had anticipated amphibious operations not as an afterthought, but as a core element of strategic doctrine. The fact that such craft did not exist reveals not merely a gap in preparation, but a fundamental assumption that the Wehrmacht would conquer Europe through rapid continental maneuver, not through seaborne assault. By the time Sea Lion became urgent, it was too late to begin the production cycles that might have made it feasible. The second alternative examines the matter of timing and sequence. Some historians have argued that Germany should have launched Sea Lion immediately after the French surrender in July 1940, before British defences had fully mobilised and while German forces were at peak strength and morale. At that moment, the Luftwaffe possessed numerical superiority in fighters. The Wehrmacht had 300,000 or more troops readily available, and the shock of French collapse still reverberated through British consciousness. The invasion barges and converted fishing vessels were being assembled and modified. A compressed timeline might have achieved crossing and lodgment before the Royal Navy could muster a decisive response. This argument carries a seductive logic, but crumbles under examination of actual German readiness. The Wehrmacht was not organized for rapid re-employment. Units needed rest, refitting, and reorganization after the French campaign. The Navy required time to gather sufficient vessels and develop invasion plans. The Luftwaffe, despite its strength, was still learning how to project power across the Channel and sustain operations over hostile territory. Germany's own commanders, when pressed for rapid invasion timelines, consistently reported that such acceleration was impossible without accepting unacceptable risk. Moreover, an invasion in July would have encountered British defences that, while incomplete, were already formidable. The Channel itself remained a barrier that could not be overcome in weeks of preparation. Military science does not respond to political urgency. The romantic appeal of the immediate invasion dissolves when confronted with the actual constraints that bound German decision-making. A third alternative focuses on inter-service coordination and the strategic choices that flowed from it. The Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and Luftwaffe presented fundamentally incompatible invasion plans, each reflecting the institutional interests and capabilities of its service. The army wanted a broad invasion front across southern England, requiring massive transport capacity and naval protection that the Navy insisted was impossible. The Navy proposed a narrow corridor, which the army rejected as too constricted for consolidation and rapid breakout. The Luftwaffe promised air supremacy, but could not deliver it against British radar-guided fighters and the resilience of the aircraft industry. In military historiography, there exists a hypothetical version of Germany, wherein these services reconcile their differences, establish unified command under Hitler's direction, and produce a coordinated invasion plan with realistic objectives and sufficient resources. This alternative requires imagining a German leadership structure fundamentally more rational, less prone to inter-service competition, and more willing to impose discipline on rival commanders. In reality, Hitler preferred to arbitrate between competing claims rather than resolve them, allowing ambiguity to persist and decisions to be deferred. Goering's promises of air victory went unchallenged despite mounting evidence of failure. The Navy's insistence on narrow invasion corridors went unresolved because Hitler lacked the will, or perhaps the understanding, to impose a unified strategy. A more decisive leader might have empowered a single commander to enforce coordination, but that leader was not Hitler. This alternative requires replacing the historical Hitler with a different sort of dictator, which is to say, it is not truly an alternative at all, but a fantasy that erases the actual constraints of the regime. The fourth alternative, and perhaps the most consequential, examines the resource constraint itself. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to simultaneously build dedicated landing craft, maintain the Luftwaffe at maximum strength, sustain the Wehrmacht across France and the Balkans, and prepare for the Russian campaign. Every spare ton of steel, every hour of factory time, every aircraft rolling off the production line represented a choice with opportunity costs. Germany's economy was not on a total war footing in 1940. The nation was spending roughly 30% of its gross national product on military production, a figure that would rise to over 80% by 1943 as the war became existential. In 1940, Hitler believed the war against France and Britain was already essentially won. Total mobilization seemed unnecessary and economically disruptive. An invasion of Britain would have consumed resources needed for other objectives, most critically, the preparation for Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Some historians have argued that Germany should have chosen, consciously and deliberately, to consolidate victory in Western Europe before turning east, investing fully in the resources required for an amphibious conquest of Britain. This argument contains logical force. A Germany that had actually invaded and occupied Britain would have gained immense resources, industrial capacity, and strategic breathing room. Yet this alternative asks us to imagine Hitler making a choice fundamentally at odds with his ideological convictions and strategic obsessions. Hitler's entire worldview centered on the necessity of destroying communism and acquiring Eastern European territory for German expansion. Britain was an obstacle to be removed, but Russia was the true enemy, the embodiment of the racial and ideological struggle that defined Nazi ideology. A Hitler who would have chosen the patient consolidation of Britain over the aggressive pursuit of Russia would have been a different figure entirely, with different priorities and different wars to fight. The cumulative weight of these alternatives reveals that Operation Sea Lion remained technically possible throughout 1940 and into early 1941. Germany possessed the military power to land troops on the English coast, establish a beachhead, and potentially break through into the interior, particularly if British defences had collapsed or fractured. Yet each alternative that might have made invasion more successful required Germany to make different choices weeks or months or years earlier, choices that were fundamentally incompatible with Hitler's actual priorities and strategic vision. To make Sea Lion feasible would have required a German state with different industrial priorities, different military organization, different leadership, and different ideological commitments. It would have required Germany to be a fundamentally different nation, pursuing a fundamentally different war for fundamentally different stakes. The invasion was not quite impossible, but it was impossible for Nazi Germany, impossible for Hitler's regime, impossible given the actual choices that the actual German leadership made in the actual historical context of 1940. This distinction between abstract possibility and historical reality is crucial. Counterfactual history has value when it illuminates the constraints and pressures that shaped actual events. It loses value when it devolves into mere speculation about imaginary nations making imaginary choices. In the final assessment offered by post-war military analysis, Sea Lion emerges as a campaign that was strategically improbable from its inception, not because any single factor rendered it impossible, but because the sum of factors created a weight that could not be overcome without fundamentally altering the regime itself. Germany was neither economically nor militarily nor psychologically prepared for the kind of patient, ruthless consolidation that would have been required after an invasion. The nation that could conquer France in 6 weeks through rapid maneuver was not the nation equipped to occupy Britain indefinitely against a population that, by every measure, remained determined to resist. An invaded Britain would not have been a quick victory leading to new objectives. It would have been a grinding, resource-consuming occupation that would have starved every other German military ambition. The Soviet Union would not have waited patiently while Germany pacified the British Isles. Italian commitments in North Africa and the Mediterranean would have demanded attention. Germany would have found itself stretched across 3 continents, committed to multiple theatres, unable to concentrate force where it would be decisive. Some historians argue this fragmentation would have been precisely the outcome that would have defeated Germany earlier and more decisively than the historical path of 1941 to 1945. In this reading, Sea Lion's cancellation was actually the product of strategic wisdom, a recognition, however muddled in expression, that Germany could not afford to pursue British invasion if it intended to attack the Soviet Union. Yet this wisdom was not conscious or articulate. It emerged from the collision of institutional competing interests and Hitler's shifting priorities, rather than from any coherent strategic vision. Germany did not choose not to invade Britain. It simply failed to invade because the effort required was too great, the prospects too uncertain, and the competition from other objectives too fierce. The invasion that might have changed everything never sailed because the Germany that might have mounted it never existed. In the spring of 1940, as German troops rolled through France and the prospect of invasion grew from whispered anxiety to operational reality, Britain faced a peculiar and profound challenge. The regular army was stretched across multiple theatres, resources were desperately limited, and professional soldiers were needed at sea and in the air, where the first battles would be fought. Yet the homeland itself required defence. If German troops gained a foothold on English soil, someone would have to stop them. That someone would not be a conscripted professional, but rather a shopkeeper, a retired schoolteacher, a farmer, or a factory worker. Out of this necessity was born the Home Guard, a civilian militia that would become a symbol of British determination and a last line of resistance should invasion come. The Home Guard did not spring fully formed from government planning. In May of 1940, with France collapsing and panic rising, the British government issued an appeal for volunteers to form local defence volunteers. The response was staggering. Within weeks, more than 1 million men had enrolled, many of them too old for active service, others too young, many physically unfit by military standards, but spiritually unfit to sit idle while their nation faced its gravest hour. They came from every social class and every profession. There were elderly men who had fought in the First World War, now in their 60s but determined to defend their homes once more. There were teenage boys who had never fired a rifle in anger, but burned with the desire to protect their families. There were factory managers, dock workers, librarians, clergymen, and farmers. The Guard became a true citizen militia, a force that reflected the breadth of British society mobilized for survival. Training these volunteers presented an extraordinary logistical puzzle. Weapons were scarce. Britain had lost enormous quantities of equipment at Dunkirk, and production could not keep pace with demand. In the early months, Home Guard units trained with whatever they could obtain or improvise. Some used antiquated rifles from the First World War, rifles that had been sitting in storage for more than 2 decades. Others trained with shotguns and sporting rifles borrowed from local gun clubs. The government even circulated pamphlets on how to construct Molotov cocktails from bottles and petrol, improvised incendiary weapons that could be hurled at tanks or armoured vehicles. In some units, men drilled with broomsticks, practicing movements and formations with wooden poles while waiting for actual weapons to arrive. It was improvisation born of necessity, but it reflected an unshakable commitment to readiness. The training itself had to be accomplished in the evenings and on weekends, fit around men's regular jobs. These were not professional soldiers with months of preparation time. They were civilians who worked in factories and offices during the day and trained as soldiers in the gathering dusk. Instructors, often retired military officers or serving soldiers seconded to militia units, had to compress essential skills into brief, intensive sessions. Men learned to dig trenches and construct anti-tank obstacles on beaches. They practiced ambush tactics in the lanes and fields of the English countryside. They studied German military tactics and equipment, learning to recognize a panzer tank's silhouette and understand how to position anti-tank guns for maximum effectiveness. Live fire exercises were conducted whenever ammunition permitted, but many units had to settle for dry run practice, men dropping into firing positions and aiming at imaginary targets while shouting "bang" to simulate the sound of gunfire. The geographic strategy of Home Guard deployment reflected a deep understanding of how an invasion would unfold. If German forces landed on the southern coast, they would have to advance inland, and the Home Guard would be positioned to harry their progress, create ambush points, and delay their movement toward London. Units were organized on a local basis, with men from each town and village forming their own platoons and companies. This local knowledge proved invaluable. The Home Guard knew the terrain intimately, every lane, every wood, every natural defensive position. They understood which bridges were critical and which roads would funnel advancing troops into killing zones. Strategic roadblocks and anti-tank obstacles were planned and, in many cases, partially constructed. If invasion came, German forces would not face an orderly military retreat, but rather a web of resistance woven through the landscape itself. Coastal defense represented the most visible and urgent Home Guard mission. From Cornwall in the southwest to Norfolk in the east, units stationed near beaches trained specifically to respond to amphibious landings. These men understood their role with crystalline clarity. They would be the first British soldiers to face German troops coming ashore. The odds would be heavily against them. A German invasion force would include experienced assault troops supported by machine guns and mortars. The Home Guard would have limited ammunition, lighter weapons, and no armor. Their job was not to defeat the invasion on the beaches, but to identify landing sites, harry the Germans as they established their beachhead, and buy time for regular army units to arrive and mount a coordinated defense. It was a role that demanded courage and a clear-eyed understanding of probable sacrifice. Beyond the military training and preparation, the Home Guard represented something equally important: psychological readiness. The volunteers and their families understood that invasion was possible, even likely. Rather than succumb to paralysis or despair, they chose action. They trained, they prepared defensive positions, and they demonstrated through their presence that Britain would not surrender without a fight. This psychological dimension rippled outward through the society. When ordinary people saw their neighbors drilling with rifles, constructing anti-tank obstacles, and preparing earnestly for the worst, it reinforced the cultural message that Britain could endure. Churchill's speeches promised defiance, but the Home Guard embodied it. The Home Guard was Churchill's words made flesh, ordinary citizens refusing to accept defeat before the battle had even begun. The equipment situation improved gradually as the months passed. By autumn of 1940, dedicated landing craft were beginning to arrive from America, and rifle production was accelerating. The Home Guard received substantial quantities of Lee Enfield rifles. the same weapon used by the regular army, along with Bren guns and anti-tank rifles. Artillery pieces, including vintage guns from earlier wars, were distributed to units tasked with defending critical positions. Gas masks were issued with the understanding that chemical weapons might be employed in an invasion. Anti-gas training became part of the curriculum, adding to the burden of knowledge the volunteers had to absorb. The accumulation of equipment, though still inadequate by professional military standards, conveyed a signal of seriousness. This was not a gesture force or a symbolic militia. This was a genuine attempt to create a credible second line of defense. Command and control structures evolved as the Home Guard matured. Initially, the force had been somewhat ad hoc, with local officers and leaders self-appointed or selected by their communities. As months passed, formal military hierarchy was imposed. Battalions were created, linking the various company and platoon units into coherent formations. Regular Army liaison officers were assigned to major units to ensure that Home Guard operations could be coordinated with military defenses. Communication networks were established, telephone trees and messenger systems that would allow information about a landing to be transmitted rapidly to higher command. Despite the amateur composition of the force, the military apparatus supporting it became increasingly professional. General Edmund Ironside, placed in command of Home Forces, took the Home Guard seriously and ensured that it was integrated into broader defensive planning rather than treated as an embarrassing afterthought. The role of women in the Home Guard, though official regulations initially restricted their participation, became increasingly important as the war progressed. While women were excluded from frontline combat roles, they served as messengers, signalers, and support personnel. They operated telephone switchboards that connected Home Guard units across entire regions. They maintained ammunition and supply depots. They trained in first aid, preparing to provide medical assistance in the chaos of battle. Some Home Guard units began training women in anti-aircraft gun operation, recognizing that they could be equally effective as men in this technical role. The contribution of women to the Home Guard never received the public recognition that the force itself achieved. But without these women, the organizational ability of the Home Guard to function would have been severely compromised. The psychological weight of this preparation cannot be overstated. The men and women of the Home Guard trained knowing that if their preparation proved necessary, they would likely face death. They were not under the illusion that a hastily organized citizen militia could repel a German invasion. They understood that if invasion came and they were called upon to fight, they would probably die. Some would be killed in the initial fighting on the beaches. Others would fall in ambushes and rearguard actions as German forces advanced inland. Still others might be captured and face an uncertain fate under German occupation. Yet night after night, in the gathering darkness of summer and autumn 1940, they came out to train. They drilled with their rifles and practiced explosive demolitions. They studied maps and memorized routes and planned fields of fire. They did this because the alternative, to do nothing while their homes and families faced existential threat, was unthinkable. By late 1940, as autumn turned toward winter and the immediate invasion threat began to fade, the Home Guard had become an institution woven into the fabric of British life. Invasion barges gathered in French ports, and the possibility of German assault remained real. But it was becoming clear to military planners on both sides that the moment for invasion was passing. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The Royal Navy remained undefeated. German strategic attention was already turning toward the Soviet Union. The Home Guard, however, did not stand down. It would remain active throughout the war, evolving from an invasion-specific force into a general home defense organization. The men and women who had volunteered in the dark hours of 1940 continued to train and prepare, though the immediate existential threat gradually receded. What the Home Guard represented extended far beyond military strategy or tactical doctrine. It was a manifestation of British refusal to contemplate defeat, a national assertion that even if professional soldiers failed and the regular military was overwhelmed, British civilians would continue to resist. The Home Guard said to Hitler and to the German High Command that Britain could not be conquered because Britain itself would fight. Every shopkeeper turned soldier, every farmer trained to handle explosives, every retired teacher learning rifle marksmanship was a statement written in action rather than words. The invasion that never came would have faced not just a professional military, but a nation armed, trained, and psychologically prepared for absolute resistance. The Home Guard proved unnecessary in the end, not because the training was worthless, but because the threat never materialized. Yet the fact that it never materialized owed something to the seriousness of British preparation, the demonstration that invasion would cost far more in blood and treasure than Germany could afford to pay. The Luftwaffe entered 1941 as the most formidable air arm in the world. Its pilots had conquered Poland in weeks, reduced France to submission in 6, and held the skies over Britain through months of relentless combat. Yet beneath the facade of invincibility, an institutional exhaustion had begun to set in, one that would prove irreversible. The Air Force that had seemed unstoppable was, in fact, burning itself out at a rate German industry could neither match nor sustain. The casualty figures told a story the High Command was reluctant to acknowledge. Trained pilots, the irreplaceable core of air power, were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Germany was spending its human capital like currency it assumed to be infinite, only to discover too late that the reserves had nearly run dry. The attrition statistics from the Battle of Britain reveal a grim mathematics that haunted German strategic planners even as they maintained public confidence in ultimate victory. Between July and October 1940, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,700 aircraft. More critically, it lost experienced pilots, men with hundreds of flight hours, men who had mastered the complexities of aerial combat in multiple theaters. A pilot with 500 hours of experience cannot be replaced in a matter of weeks. The training pipeline for such expertise stretches across months, sometimes years. German pilot training programs, though rigorous, could not produce replacements at the rate losses were occurring. By the time a new pilot earned his fighter qualification, 3 or 4 of his predecessors had been shot down over England or killed during their long, fuel-constrained flights back across the Channel. The Luftwaffe's officer corps understood this mathematics with crystalline clarity, even when political pressure demanded they express confidence in victory. The conditions under which Luftwaffe pilots flew over Britain exacted a peculiar toll beyond simple combat losses. A German fighter pilot on a mission from occupied France faced a journey that consumed fuel at an alarming rate. Takeoff from a French airfield, climb to altitude, flight across the Channel, combat operations over British territory, and then the long return journey home. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's primary fighter, carried limited fuel reserves by design. German aircraft were optimized for short-range tactical superiority rather than long-endurance operations. A pilot who engaged in intense aerial combat over London could find himself with barely enough fuel to reach the French coast upon withdrawal. There was no margin for error, no luxury of cruising at economical throttle settings. Every sortie meant flying at power settings that drained the tanks quickly, making the return journey a constant negotiation with the laws of aeronautics and physics. Pilots who belly-landed their damaged fighters in the Channel or crash-landed short of their home airfields were lost not because they lacked flying skill, but because their aircraft's design imposed limitations no amount of courage could overcome. The geography of the Channel, which had seemed to offer Germany a manageable barrier to cross when invasion plans were first drawn, became instead a merciless weapon in British hands. A British pilot shot down over England could bail out, parachute into friendly territory, find his way to a base, and within days be flying another sortie. A German pilot who ditched in the Channel or crash-landed in the sea faced capture or drowning. The numerical advantage in pilot losses was therefore magnified by geography into a devastating strategic imbalance. For every German pilot the Luftwaffe lost, Britain lost fewer irreplaceable veterans, and those British pilots who survived shootdowns could return to combat. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced aviators into the Channel at rates that no training program could compensate for. German commanders recognized that this asymmetry favored Britain in a long war of attrition, yet the political imperative to maintain air superiority over the invasion preparations left them no choice but to continue flying the unsustainable missions. By the time the Luftwaffe shifted from attempting air superiority to launching the night bombing campaign against British cities, the composition of its pilot force had fundamentally changed. The veterans who had conquered the skies over France, men with hundreds of combat hours, men who had evolved their tactics through experience and survived the learning curve, were increasingly absent from the roles. Replacements, younger and less experienced, filled the depleted squadrons. These new pilots were brave and reasonably well trained within the constraints of wartime instruction, but they lacked the instinctive mastery that comes only through extended operations. A pilot with 10 hours of combat experience might perform adequately in favorable circumstances, but against British fighters who had logged 50 or 100 hours, the odds shifted dramatically. The Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign was partly a tactical response to British day fighter superiority, but it was also a strategic acknowledgement that the force composition had changed in ways that favored defensive rather than aggressive air operations. The aircraft themselves bore witness to the strain of continuous operations. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Bf 110, along with the bomber fleet, required constant maintenance and repair. Airframes fatigued under the stress of repeated takeoffs and landings, combat maneuvers, and the vibrations of sustained high-power flight. The German aircraft industry was producing replacement machines, but the production rate, while impressive by any standard except that of total war, could not keep pace with combat losses and the attrition imposed by mechanical fatigue. Engines wore out, ammunition boxes corroded, landing gear failures became more frequent as aircraft aged beyond their design specifications. The ground crews who maintained the Luftwaffe's aircraft worked under impossible conditions, inadequate facilities in occupied territory, constant movement as squadrons rotated through various bases, and the psychological weight of knowing that their maintenance errors could cost pilots their lives. The aircraft that survived were increasingly worn machines, reliable but aging, their performance margins eroding with every flight hour. The Luftwaffe's high command began to face a strategic reckoning in early 1941 that none of them had anticipated in the euphoria of continental conquest. Hermann Göring had staked his reputation and his influence with Hitler on the promise that air power alone could break British resistance and establish the conditions for Sea Lion to proceed. That promise had not materialized. The Royal Air Force had not been defeated. British aircraft production had not ceased. The British population had not surrendered. The summer offensive had yielded tactical victories, cities bombed, industrial targets struck, the national psyche tested, but no strategic breakthrough. As autumn turned to winter and invasion became logistically impractical, the Luftwaffe faced a bitter conclusion. It had failed at its central mission. This failure was not the result of cowardice or lack of effort. It was the consequence of the limitations of air power when employed against an enemy with superior numbers, home field advantage, and access to a continuous stream of replacement aircraft and trained pilots. The reassignment of Luftwaffe units away from the Channel and toward the Balkans and Eastern preparations represented both a practical necessity and an implicit admission of defeat. In the spring of 1941, German forces moved south and east. The Balkan campaign required air support. The planned invasion of the Soviet Union would demand massive air forces. The Luftwaffe was stretched across an expanding geographic footprint, its resources divided among multiple theatres. Units that had flown sortie after sortie over southern England were relocated to Greek airfields and eventually to positions along the German-Soviet border. This dispersal did not reflect confidence in the Luftwaffe's ability to dominate British skies. Rather, it reflected the abandonment of that objective. The air force that had seemed poised to deliver the final blow against Britain was now being systematically redistributed toward other